In November of 1520, a Portuguese captain sailing for the Spanish crown stared out at a grey, wind-torn coastline near the bottom of South America and saw something that would eventually be written into every textbook, every documentary, every children's book about the age of exploration. Ferdinand Magellan had found the passage, the strait that would let a ship sail from the Atlantic into the Pacific without going around the entire frozen bottom of the world. History remembers this as a triumph, clean and simple. Brave explorer finds waterway, names it, sails through, changes the map forever. But here's the question nobody really asks. What did Magellan actually see out there? Not what we were told he saw centuries later in some tidy summary. What did the man himself, freezing, half-starving, terrified his own crew might slit his throat in the night, actually witness with his own eyes in those weeks? Because the more you dig into the primary accounts, the ones written by the actual sailors who survived, the stranger the story gets. There were lights on the shore, dozens of them, flickering in the darkness along a coastline that seemed otherwise empty of people. Magellan's men had no idea what they were looking at. Were they campfires? Signals? Something else entirely? They named the place Tierra del Fuego, Land of Fire, based on something they couldn't actually explain. And that's just the beginning. The maps that came out of this voyage, the ones that shaped European understanding of the world for the next century, were full of guesses dressed up as facts. Coastlines that didn't exist. Channels drawn with total confidence by men who'd barely glimpsed them through fog and sleet. There was an atmosphere down there, in the words of the survivors themselves, like they'd sailed to the actual edge of the world. Mountains that seemed impossibly wrong. Snow in places snow shouldn't be. A silence that pressed down on grown men until some of them broke completely. If you're settling in to fall asleep tonight, that's genuinely why these stories exist. So let your mind drift while I do the talking. Tell me in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now where you are. I read these every so often, and it's wild. Someone in Lisbon at midnight, someone in Manila at their morning coffee, all listening to the same slow unravelling of a 500-year-old mystery. If you want this without any ads breaking up the quiet, we're on Spotify now, links in the description, totally free to follow. And if these help you sleep, a 5-star review actually helps other people find their way here too. So if you've got 30 seconds before you drift off, that would mean a lot. Now, back to Magellan. What I want to do over the next while is slow way down and actually look at what happened in 1520. Not the legend, not the version that got smoothed out for school books, but what the actual men on those ships recorded. What they couldn't have known, what they misread, and where the popular story we all grew up with quietly drifted away from the truth. There's uncertainty in parts of this. Historians still argue about pieces of it. But that uncertainty, that fog, is kind of the point. Let's go back to the beginning. Before the strait. Before the fires. Back to why Magellan was even down there in the first place. To understand why Magellan was standing on the deck of a creaking ship at the bottom of the world in 1520, you have to go back further, decades further, to a rivalry that had already reshaped the known world once and was about to do it again. Spain and Portugal, two small kingdoms on the edge of Europe, had spent the better part of a century racing each other toward the same prize. Spices, cloves, nutmeg, cinnamon, pepper. Things that seem almost quaint to us now, sitting in little jars in a kitchen cabinet. But in the early 1500s, these were worth more than gold by weight. A ship that returned from the Indies loaded with spices could make a merchant house wealthy for generations. And whoever controlled the routes to get there controlled the wealth of the age. Portugal had gotten there first, sailing east around the bottom of Africa. And by the time Magellan was a young man, Portuguese ships were already doing brisk business in the Indian Ocean. Spain, meanwhile, had bet everything on Columbus and his promise of a western route to Asia, only to find, awkwardly, an entire unexpected continent sitting in the way. 2 continents, actually, though nobody fully understood that yet. The question that consumed European courts for the next 30 years was deceptively simple. Was there a way around this obstacle? A gap, a strait, some kind of opening that would let a ship pass through the Americas and continue west into the Pacific, into the Spice Islands, without having to fight Portugal for the African route. This is the world Magellan stepped into, and here's where his story gets complicated in a way that most textbooks skip right past. Magellan wasn't Spanish. He was Portuguese, born into a minor noble family, trained as a sailor and soldier in Portuguese service in India and North Africa. He'd fought in Portuguese wars, been wounded in Portuguese battles, and for years he'd tried to convince his own king, Manuel I, to fund exactly the kind of westward expedition he eventually led. Manuel said no, multiple times. Some historians think it was personal, that Manuel simply didn't like Magellan, found him arrogant or difficult. Others think it was strategic, that Portugal already had its eastern route secured, and saw no reason to gamble resources on an unproven western gap that might not even exist. Whatever the reason, Magellan did something that would have been almost unthinkable a generation earlier. He defected. He walked away from his home country, renounced his allegiance, and offered his services and his theory to Spain instead, to the young King Charles I, who would later become the Holy Roman Emperor. Try to imagine what that meant in 1517. This wasn't like changing jobs. This was treason in the eyes of many Portuguese, a betrayal that followed Magellan for the rest of his life and shaped how his own crew would eventually see him. A Portuguese captain leading Spanish ships, surrounded by Spanish officers who had every reason to distrust him, some of whom likely saw him as an opportunist at best and a traitor at worst. This tension never fully went away. It sat there, quiet and simmering, through the entire voyage. Several of the expedition's senior officers were Spanish noblemen who resented taking orders from a foreign captain, and that resentment would eventually explode into open mutiny, something we'll get into later. But even before any of that happened, before the ships had crossed the Atlantic, Magellan was operating from a position that was fragile in ways that had nothing to do with wind or weather. His authority rested on a royal commission, yes, but also on his ability to hold together a fleet full of men who weren't entirely sure they trusted him, backing a theory that most of Europe's best navigators considered a long shot at best. And what exactly was that theory? This is worth sitting with for a moment, because the crew's understanding of what they were even looking for shaped everything that came after. Magellan believed, based on maps, rumours, and possibly information passed to him through Portuguese contacts who'd sailed portions of the South American coast, that somewhere south of the territories Spain and Portugal had already charted, there existed a passage. A strait connecting the Atlantic to what explorers were beginning to call the South Sea, the vast ocean that Vasco Núñez de Balboa had glimpsed from a mountaintop in Panama just a few years earlier. Nobody in Europe had actually seen this ocean's true scale. Balboa had seen a sliver of coastline and some water stretching to the horizon. Magellan's crew and Magellan himself had no real concept of how enormous that ocean actually was. How many thousands of miles of open water lay between South America and Asia? They believed, reasonably given the information available to them, that once they found the passage, the Spice Islands would be a relatively short sail beyond it. This gap between expectation and reality matters enormously for everything that follows in this story, because expectation shapes perception in ways that are almost impossible to resist. When you're desperately searching for something, a gap in a coastline, an opening, a way through, you start seeing possibilities in places where there might be nothing at all. Every bay looks like it might be the entrance. Every river mouth becomes a candidate. The mind, especially a mind under stress, exhausted, cold, frightened of mutiny and starvation, has a way of finding what it's looking for whether or not it's actually there. So this was the fleet that left Spain in September of 1519. 5 ships, roughly 270 men, a Portuguese captain whose loyalty was suspect to half his own officers, a theory about a passage that might not exist, and a destination whose true distance nobody on board could accurately imagine. The cohesion holding this expedition together was thinner than anyone back in the Spanish court probably realized. It would take less than a year at sea for that fragile unity to start cracking, long before anyone caught sight of a strait, long before anyone saw a single flickering fire on a distant shore. To understand what Magellan and his men reported seeing in Patagonia and in the strait, you have to start with the machines they were riding and the bodies they were riding in. Because nothing in this story is happening from the vantage point of a satellite or a neat incline on a modern map. It's happening from the rolling, unstable deck of a 16th century ship that was, by our standards, barely seaworthy. These were not sleek, purpose-built ocean liners. They were small carracks and caravels, hybrids of cargo haulers and coastal traders, pushed into work they were never truly designed for. Heavy, round-bellied hulls with a deep draught, high forecastles and sterncastles that caught the wind like barn doors. Under ideal conditions they might average 4 or 5 knots. Under bad conditions they drifted, or worse, they became battering rams for their own anchors and cables. Steering was crude. The rudder chains could snap. The tiller could break an arm or a rib if the sea slammed into the stern at the wrong angle. Sails were not easily trimmed for fine manoeuvring. You didn't dance along a jagged shoreline in a vessel like that. You tiptoed and prayed, knowing that a single misjudged depth, a reef that wasn't on anyone's chart, could punch a hole in your hull and end hundreds of lives in a night. Navigation was no more forgiving. The crew had compasses, yes, and hourglasses, and cross-staffs or astrolabes to take rough readings of the sun's altitude when the weather allowed. But there was no accurate longitude. East-west position was guesswork, built from dead reckoning, speed estimated by eye, direction by compass, time by sand. Every passing day pushed their calculated position farther away from reality. Even latitude, theoretically simpler, depended on a clear horizon and a cooperative sky. In fog, in heavy cloud, in southern winter, when the sun arched low and brief over the horizon, even that simple measurement could vanish for days. This fragile technical world created a constant background noise of risk. Every unknown inlet might be a harbour, but it might also be a dead end with a sandbar across the mouth. Every headland you rounded without sounding the depth was a gamble. The further south they sailed, the more dangerous the winds became, shifting, gusty, funneled by headlands and islands in ways no European pilot had ever charted. Under those conditions, what you decide is a strait or a bay is not an abstract cartographic judgment. It's a survival decision being made minute by minute, with a hull that cannot easily turn around. Layered on top of this mechanical fragility was something quieter, but even more powerful, the bodies of the men themselves. Every witness whose words we read today was hungry. Every eye looking at those distant shores was bloodshot from lack of sleep, irritated by salt, smoke, and cold wind. Food on a voyage like this was always in some stage between stale and lethal. Hardtack crawling with weevils, salt meat turning rancid in the hold, casks leaking, water going slimy, then sour, then undrinkable. Fresh food, when they had it, disappeared quickly. By the time they approached the latitudes of Patagonia, vitamin deficiencies were already creeping in. Scurvy doesn't announce itself politely. It begins with fatigue, with gums that bleed a little when you chew, with a general sense that everything is heavier than it ought to be. Wounds heal more slowly, bruises appear from nothing. Teeth loosen. Add to this the respiratory infections that thrive in cold, damp air. The infections from minor cuts that never quite dry out. The lice, the constant need to perform heavy physical labour while your body is slowly falling apart. These are the lenses through which Magellan's men looked at the world. A coastline glimpsed after weeks at sea is not just rock and scrub. It is the promise of fresh water, or the threat of hostile people, or both, blurred by fever and exhaustion. Sleep came in fragments. Watches cut the night into shifts. You might doze for an hour, then be shaken awake to haul on ropes, to reef sails in a squall, to man the pumps when a seam started weeping in the dark. Standing orders demanded that lookouts remain at their posts, but cold and monotony are powerful sedatives. A man half asleep in the crow's nest, fingers numb, eyes watering from wind and spray, does not see with the clarity of a rested observer in a chair. Fear sharpened some perceptions and dulled others. Rumours of giants in the south had circulated in Europe for decades. Tales of monstrous peoples at the world's edge were part of the mental furniture these sailors carried with them. So when they glimpsed tall figures moving on a distant shore, or saw footprints larger than they expected pressed into wet sand, those preloaded stories rushed in to fill the gaps. A shadow becomes a giant. A campfire becomes proof of a vast hidden population. A trick of perspective makes far mountains look impossibly high, the world itself bending under them. All of this hunger, illness, fatigue, fear, meant that the world these men reported was not a neutral recording of external reality. It was a conversation between the land and their own failing bodies. Then there was the hierarchy, the chain of command that decided, often silently, whose version of reality would be preserved. At the top sat Magellan, with legal authority from the Spanish crown. Below him, Spanish captains commanding individual ships. Below them, pilots and masters responsible for navigation. And far beneath, the common sailors, the gunners, the boys, the enslaved, and the conscripted indigenous interpreters, whose names we often never learn. Information flowed upward, but not all of it arrived intact. A lookout might shout that he saw smoke on a distant shore. By the time that shout reached the quarterdeck, it had passed through another sailor, maybe an officer, and then Magellan's own assumptions. The log would record not the raw first impression, but the filtered version. We saw signs of people, or many fires were perceived along the land. The original uncertainty, the hesitation in the lookout's voice, does not make it onto the page. Add mistrust to this filtering process. Spanish officers, already suspicious of Magellan's loyalty, were not eager to emphasize observations that made him seem perceptive, inspired, or chosen by God. Likewise, men with grudges against particular captains might downplay or exaggerate what was seen from those captains' decks. Testimony was not just about what happened, it was also about who got to be right, who would later be praised or blamed when reports reached the court in Seville. Even within a single ship, status shaped visibility. A common seaman might notice that the coastline bent in a curious way, that the current seemed to tug more strongly toward a particular opening. But unless a pilot asked his opinion, that observation stayed in his head. When later chroniclers, most of them educated men, often not sailors themselves, sat down to compile narratives, they leaned heavily on officers' accounts, royal reports, formal depositions. The voices of the lookouts, the men whose job it actually was to stare into fog and darkness, and interpret faint smudges on the horizon, rarely appear. And what could those lookouts truly see? Imagine yourself at the top of a swaying mast in the raw wind of a southern autumn. The sea surface is a shifting grey plain, low fog hangs in banks, tearing and reforming. Rain squalls drift in sheets that erase the horizon, then lift just enough to show you a vague line of land before closing again. Distances are treacherous in air like that. A headland that seems close may be 10 miles away. A bay that looks like a wide opening might narrow to a river mouth, just out of sight. Light changes everything. Morning haze, evening glare, the long twilight of high latitudes. In those conditions, a narrow channel that cuts deeply into the land can masquerade as a shallow bight, and a fjord-like inlet can be read as the entrance to a great passage. The men at the masthead had no binoculars. Their only tools were their eyes, their experience, and the stories they'd been told to expect. When the order came down, watch for a passage. Any passage, they did what human minds always do under instruction. They became more sensitive to certain patterns, breaks in the coastline, changes in the colour of water, lines of waves that hinted at submerged bars or meeting currents. But increased sensitivity does not guarantee accuracy. It guarantees more candidates, more maybe that's something moments. Later historians reading the official narratives often forget how contingent all of this was. A sentence such as "the Captain General saw many fires all along the coast" carries an air of authority. It suggests a single clear observation made by the man in charge. But in reality, it may encode a chain of events that began with a half-asleep lookout thinking he saw a flicker in the mist, or with a pilot interpreting the reddish glow of sunset on cloud as smoke from land. The voices we have, the chronicler Pigafetta, the royal reports, the testimonies taken after mutiny and disaster, are not neutral lenses. They are the perspectives of educated men, close to power, writing with specific audiences in mind. They wanted to impress, to justify, to explain. They trimmed away ambiguity. They rarely admitted, in plain language, how unsure they actually were about what they had seen at the world's edge. If we take those official voices at face value, we inherit their certainty along with their blind spots. We start to believe in a clean, continuous story. The coastline was like this. The people were like that. The ships went here and then here. But the reality on the water in 1520 was far messier. Every sighting was an interpretation under pressure, shaped by failing bodies, feuding officers, crude instruments, and weather that did not care about European theories. Keep that in mind as the fleet approaches Patagonia, because what they were about to encounter there was not just a landscape. It was a psychological threshold, a test of how long men could keep believing in a passage when the world itself seemed determined to swallow them. When the coast that Europeans would later call Patagonia first drew near, nothing about it announced a new continent or a famous region. It was just land after a long stretch of grey water. Low hills, scrub, the outline of distant mountains when the air was clear enough. But the men on Magellan's ships weren't arriving with blank minds. They were carrying maps that stopped in empty white, stories of monsters at the edge of the world, and bodies already pushed to the limit. The first shock was latitude itself. Most of these sailors were men of the mid-latitudes, Iberia, the Mediterranean, perhaps the Azores or Madeira. They knew winters with rain and occasional frost, not long seasons when cold wind seemed to crawl under your skin and stay there. The further south they sailed along that coast, the stranger the light became. Days that felt short even when the sun was technically above the horizon. Long twilights that never quite delivered full dark, just a dim, colourless in-between. In our age we talk about circadian rhythms and seasonal affective disorder. They had no such language, but they felt the same physiological drag, sleep that never satisfied, a kind of flatness of mood. Men woke from their broken rest already tired, already slightly disoriented, then stepped onto a deck rimmed with ice or soaked with freezing spray. Cold they had expected, at least in the abstract, but cold that seemed to intensify as you watched the coastline. Cold that came with winds capable of shifting direction 3 times in a single afternoon. That was different. Patagonia's weather is famously mercurial even now. To men whose previous experience of winter storms came from the Bay of Biscay or the North Atlantic, this felt like another category entirely. The wind didn't just oppose them, it toyed with them, offered a few days of clear skies and manageable seas, then slammed them with blasts that stripped skin from knuckles and drove spray into every seam of the ship. Under those conditions, any glimpse of human presence on shore acquired an outsized emotional weight. The early encounters with the local peoples of that region, likely Tehuelche groups along the Atlantic coast, were filtered through all of this physiological and psychological strain. From the deck of a rolling ship, a person standing by the waterline looks smaller or larger depending on distance, angle, and the height of the observer's eye. A man of average height seen from low in the waist of the ship might not seem impressive. The same figure glimpsed from a high stern castle against a low horizon can appear elongated, uncanny, add cloaks of guanaco skin, hair lifted and flattened by gusts, the unfamiliar geometry of body paint or ornaments, and you have all the ingredients for seeing something other rather than simply different. Communication was rudimentary at best. There were gestures, gifts, tentative landings. There was also fear on both sides. The locals watched odd wooden islands anchored offshore, spewing smoke and voices in strange tongues. The Europeans watched people who moved confidently in a land that already felt hostile, people who seemed at ease in a climate that hurt European lungs. Misunderstandings were inevitable. A local signalling for distance or caution might be read as a threat. A refusal to trade might be interpreted as arrogance or proof of some inhuman nature. A simple fact these people were, on average, taller than many Iberian peasants became, via rumour, they are giants. A track in wet sand that had softened and spread under repeated steps became a footprint twice the size of ours. Once those exaggerations started, life aboard the ships ensured they would not fade. They would grow. A sailing ship is a rumour factory. News circulates faster than food and with fewer checks. A cabin boy overhears an officer mentioning very tall men and repeats it to a gunner who tells his messmates, who add details from older stories they've heard of monstrous races in the south. By the time it reaches the forecastle, the tale may include men twice as tall as Christians, with voices like thunder and strength enough to uproot trees. The important part is not whether anyone consciously lies. It's that human memory and storytelling work by pattern and emphasis. If the pattern in your head says, "The farther from Europe you go, the stranger and larger the peoples become," then any ambiguous observation slots neatly into that frame. The next time someone peers through drizzle at a dark shape on shore, he's primed to see a giant, and when he reports it, the pattern grows stronger. Wintering magnified everything. To make it through the southern winter, Magellan anchored in what he named Puerto San Julian. That meant weeks of relative immobility. The horizon no longer changed. The men had time, too much time, to think about what they had already seen and what might lie ahead. Storms that might have passed quickly at sea now pinned them in place, howling over the masts while the ships tugged at their anchors. Waiting is its own kind of torture on an expedition built around motion. There was work, of course, repairs, provisioning, hunting when possible. But there were also long hours of enforced idleness. Cards, dice, whispered conversations in the dim between decks. In that kind of confinement, every story told becomes a small performance, a way to claim attention, to assert status. I saw the biggest of them all. I was close enough to touch one. You should have seen the size of their footprints up the estuary. Dread likes empty time. So does hope. The strait they were seeking, if it existed, lay somewhere further south. Each problem encountered in Patagonia, each storm and each unsettling contact with local people, became both a warning and a test. If they could survive this, perhaps they would earn the passage. If it was this bad here, what horrors might wait beyond? Back in Europe, Patagonia quickly became less a place and more a canvas. Reports filtered home through multiple layers. Pilots' logs, captains' letters, royal summaries, then printed accounts compiled by people who had never left the continent. Details that sounded ordinary were trimmed away. Details that sounded extraordinary were highlighted, embellished, copied. A mention of men of great stature hardened into a race of giants. A note on long winter nights and harsh winds became proof that this was truly the world's edge, a land half in, half out of the habitable zone. Maps began to show Patagonum Regio with tiny figures sketched larger than life. Readers who had never seen an ocean, let alone sailed one, accepted these images as fact. Meanwhile, the psychological threshold that Magellan's men had actually crossed, the inner shift from the world is large but known to, the world is stranger and less forgiving than we imagined, vanished behind the spectacle of giants and marvels. For the men on the ships, though, Patagonia's power did not lie in any single monstrous sighting. It lay in accumulation. Cold that wouldn't leave their bones, nights that felt too long, people on shore who defied their expectations, and the gnawing awareness that they were now far beyond any easy retreat. They had stepped into a region where rumour ran ahead of them, where their own stories about what they saw were already beginning to escape their control. The winter harbour that promised rest also gave men time to add up their private ledgers of fear and resentment. For weeks the ships rode at anchor in that bleak inlet, the same cliffs, the same wind, the same grey water. Instead of new horizons, there was repetition. And repetition has a way of sharpening every discomfort into an argument. Food was already an issue. The further you are from familiar supply lines, the more every mouth feels like a liability. Rations were cut, then cut again. Fresh meat from shore helped when hunting went well, but it didn't erase the hard math in the officers' heads. They were far, very far, from any known resupply. The route south was hypothetical. The route home was long but proven. Every biscuit gnawed in San Julian felt like one that could have been eaten on the safer way back to Spain. Hunger phrase trust. The men knew Magellan was Portuguese in service of the Spanish crown, a foreigner leading Castilian nobles and crews. That had always been a sore point, but cold and scarcity made it dangerous. Whispers started, that he was hiding information, that he planned to push them into impossible latitudes to satisfy his pride, that he would rather see ships wrecked than turn back and admit defeat. Disagreement over the route became the respectable surface of deeper fears. On paper, it was a debate about navigation. Was there really a strait somewhere ahead, or should they give up and retreat before winter closed in? Underneath, it was about meaning. Were they on a grand, divinely favoured venture, or had they been dragged to the edge of the world by a captain chasing a ghost? What we know as the Mutiny in Puerto San Julian emerged from that stew of hunger, cold, pride, and doubt. Several Spanish captains, men of rank who felt slighted by Magellan's authority, aligned with officers and crew who had simply had enough. They used the stillness of harbour as their moment. No storm to blame, no enemy fleet, just a quiet night, sudden seizures of ships, a flurry of shouted orders, and for a brief, very real interval, Magellan's control of his own expedition disintegrated. Here the sources tilt sharply. The main detailed account we have is by Antonio Pigafetta, loyal to Magellan and writing with the benefit of survival and hindsight. In his narrative, the mutineers are treacherous, almost faceless villains. Magellan, in contrast, is firm, patient, then decisively just. He outmaneuvers the rebels by a mix of deception and force, retakes the ships, and imposes punishment that is harsh, but, in Pigafetta's framing, necessary. It's a compelling story. It also leaves out a great deal. Mutiny is not shouted into existence by a handful of malcontents. It grows in the spaces that official narratives rarely illuminate. Quiet conversations between decks, long side-eyed looks during roll call, the moment when a man who has always obeyed begins to imagine that disobedience might be survivable. Those men rarely get to explain themselves later. If they lose, their words vanish with them. If they win, they usually don't call it mutiny. Magellan's response was brutal by modern standards, and severe even by the norms of his time. Executions on shore, a captain stabbed and then quartered, others marooned, public spectacles of punishment designed not just to remove leaders, but to send a message to every doubtful man watching: there will be no vote on whether we continue. This is not a partnership. Those decisions shaped his afterlife as a character. To some later writers, he became the archetype of the iron-willed explorer, willing to sacrifice anyone, including friends and gentlemen, to keep the course. To others, he was a tyrant, more concerned with personal glory than with the lives under his command. Both portraits grow from the same event, coloured differently by the storyteller's priorities. For our purposes, what matters is what this did to the expedition's internal landscape. Imagine being an ordinary sailor after San Julian. The fear that had once focused on giants or storms now had a human face. The captain standing on the quarterdeck, capable of ordering your death if he read your hesitation as disloyalty. That doesn't erase doubt, it drives it underground. Men still wondered if a strait existed, still fretted about dwindling food and encroaching winter. They just learned to keep those thoughts to themselves, or to share them only with the safest of confidants. Silence has historical consequences. When your main surviving narrative comes from the winning side, in an atmosphere where disagreement was literally fatal, you are hearing a curated version of events. Mutineers' motives are simplified. Structural problems, poor provisioning, unrealistic timelines, political tensions between Portuguese and Castilian elites shrink to the size of personal wickedness. Sources generated under those conditions are self-protective documents. Pigafetta and others had to navigate their own political realities once they returned to court. Emphasizing Magellan's righteousness and the mutineers' villainy was a way of aligning with royal expectations, of smoothing over the embarrassing fact that a Spanish fleet had nearly torn itself apart far from home. Every sentence carries that pressure. The cost aboard the ships was not just a few lives cut short. It was a subtle warping of decision-making as they prepared to leave their winter harbour. From that point on, officers inclined to caution would think twice before voicing it too strongly. A proposal to slow down, to scout more carefully, to reconsider a dangerous channel, could be read as the first step toward disobedience. Magellan, having just survived a challenge to his authority, had every incentive to demonstrate resolve. Turning back now, even if prudence suggested it, might look like admitting his adversaries had been right. So when we imagine the fleet edging southward again into coils of coast no European had ever mapped, we have to see more than hulls and sails. We have to see a command structure stiffened by recent violence, a crew cowed but not necessarily convinced, and a captain whose need to maintain control was now entwined with every navigational choice. Later crisis narratives love this moment. They highlight the blood, the drama of midnight plots and executions at dawn. They make Puerto San Julian the pivot on which everything turns, the test that proves Magellan's greatness or condemns his cruelty. In doing so, they often overshadow the quieter, more persistent realities. The ongoing ration calculations, the slow wear of cold on joints and tempers, the day-to-day compromises by which men actually keep an expedition functioning. Those mundane pressures did not vanish after the mutiny, they deepened. Hunger still gnawed, weather still shifted without warning. The strait, if it existed, was still just a hypothesis drawn on a few speculative charts and held in the mind of a determined man. When the lookout on one of those half-rebellious, half-terrified ships finally cried out at the sight of an opening in the coast, what followed was not a calm scientific investigation of a neutral landscape. It was a decision made by people who had just seen what resistance could cost, who knew that discipline on this voyage was written in blood, and who carried, into every new channel and bay, the memory of a winter harbour where the expedition had almost ended before the famous passage even began. By 1520, navigation was both astonishingly capable and astonishingly blind. The men on Magellan's ships could do something no Paleolithic hunter could dream of. They could leave sight of land on purpose and still usually find their way back. They did it with dead reckoning, with latitude sailing, with habits drilled into muscle and memory. But those same methods had cracks in them wide enough to swallow a continent. Dead reckoning sounds deliberate and scientific. In practice, it was a carefully disciplined guessing game. You start from a known point, last harbour, last landfall, last noon latitude, and then you stack estimates. The helmsman keeps the ship roughly on a chosen heading. The master records speed by watching how fast the water slides past the hull, or how many knots a weighted line pays out in a set time. The hours are counted in sandglasses. At intervals, someone walks the deck and notes down so many hours on such a course, at such an estimated speed. From that they walk the ship across the chart. But every input is soft. The compass isn't pointing to true north. Variation changes with place and is only imperfectly known. The log line is crude. Currents slide the whole ship sideways without announcing themselves. A half knot of current, sustained for days, can move you dozens of miles off your imagined line. Each estimate drifts a little, and those drifts accumulate. Latitude was different. Latitude was the strong pillar they trusted. By 1520, Iberian pilots had refined ways of finding how far north or south they were. At noon, when the sun reached its highest point, they measured the angle between sun and horizon with a cross staff or astrolabe. Correct that angle with tables that told you the sun's declination for that date, and you could say, "We are at such and such degrees south." This was magical compared to wandering purely by feel. It meant that on the open ocean you could pick a target latitude and simply sail along the parallel until you hit land or an island group. The route to the Cape Verde Islands, to the Azores, to Brazil, all of these depended on that trick. But latitude only gives you a line, not a point. You can know you're at 52 degrees south and still have no idea whether you're 50 miles or 500 miles east or west of a cape, a bay, or a channel. That was longitude, the ghost coordinate they could feel but not see. The basic concept of longitude, east-west position measured in degrees, existed. What they did not have was a reliable way to measure time precisely enough at sea to turn the concept into numbers. Without an accurate portable clock, the difference between local noon and a reference noon drifts into confusion. Cloudy skies wipe out star sightings. Storms scramble all your careful estimates. You carry longitude in your head as a set of hopes and corrections and suspicions, never as a clean, agreed-upon figure. That uncertainty becomes critical along a broken, twisting coast. Reading a coastline from the deck of a 16th-century ship is a strange mix of art and terror. Cliffs and headlands look different depending on light, clouds, and distance. What seems like a grand opening from 10 miles out can close into a shallow bay. A subtle gap in the line of hills might hide a deep navigable channel, or a dead-end lagoon with a sandbar guarding its mouth. Sailors learn to be wary of false mouths, those inviting spaces where the sea seems to pour into the land, but where soundings suddenly leap from comforting depth to ominous shallows. In an unknown shore, every inlet could be the passage you're hunting, and every passage could be a trap. This is where pilots mattered. A pilot was not just a man with a compass, he was the memory of all the coasts he had ever seen. He knew how a certain kind of swell breaking on a certain colour of rock might mean submerged reefs. He could watch seabirds' patterns and guess at nearby shoals or river mouths. His logbooks and his stories tied this new cold coast to warmer ones he had known. To test what their eyes and the pilot's judgment suggested, they turned to the lead and line. Taking soundings was slow, repetitive, and utterly necessary. A weight at the end of a knotted rope would be heaved ahead of the ship. When it struck bottom, they read the depth by feeling which knot hit the waterline. In shallower areas, the lead's tallow-smeared base picked up sand, mud, or shell fragments, giving clues about the seafloor. Depth increasing steadily might suggest a main channel. Depth suddenly leaping from safety to danger meant backing off, rethinking. Sometimes they sent out a boat first, with a small crew to creep closer in, taking soundings and peering for breakers. Coastal reconnaissance like this bought them information at the price of time and risk. A squall could blow up while the boat was separated. A hidden rock could stove it in. Men had already seen their comrades die for less. After San Julian, volunteering for such duties carried not just the fear of the sea, but the knowledge that refusing might be read as disloyal. All of this, the dead reckoning, the noon latitudes, the pilot's experience, the endless plumb of the lead, fed into the rough sketches that would, months or years later, harden into maps. When you look at those maps in a book today, coastlines appear crisp, inevitable, almost platonic. The strait curves this way, the islands fall that way, the entrances and exits sit exactly where they should be. Printed lines give an illusion of certainty that did not exist on the days they were drawn. Cartographers smoothed messy journals into continuous coasts. Gaps were bridged with guesswork. Where witnesses disagreed, a choice was made, and the chosen version became ink, then copperplate, then canon. Once a passage is on a widely circulated chart, later readers tend to treat it as if everyone involved must have been aiming for that precise shape all along. From our vantage point, we say Magellan searched for the strait, as though he and his men were following a dotted line printed in their minds, inevitable and solid. In reality, the search was a chain of hunches and corrections, turning into one bay, retreating, edging into another, arguing over vague signs of tides and currents, listening to pilots who disagreed among themselves. The language of discovery flattens those uncertainties. To discover a passage suggests that it was there, waiting, labelled in invisible ink, and that someone of sufficient will and genius would always have found it. The more we repeat that story, the more every inlet they did not choose, every wrong turn, every fearful night at anchor in some cul-de-sac of rock and wind, drops out of the narrative. But on those nights in 1520, with no clocks fit for purpose, no accurate longitudes, only partial charts and a coastline that folded in on itself like crumpled paper, nothing about a strait was inevitable. What they could know was bounded by their instruments, their methods, and their courage. What they couldn't know stretched out in front of them in the form of every dark gap between headlands. Into one of those gaps, soon they would steer. Not because a neat map told them where to go, but because after all the mutinies and doubts and misread bays, something about that particular opening seemed, for reasons partly rational and partly emotional, worth the risk of entering. From out at sea, the Atlantic entrance to the Strait of Magellan does not look like the gateway to another ocean. It looks like more coast. Imagine yourself on the deck a few miles offshore. The horizon is a low, irregular line of hills and headlands, nothing like the dramatic pillars and doorways that later painters would give it. There are no towering cliffs framing a knife-cut channel, no obvious river pouring its brown plume into the sea. Instead, the land rises and falls gently, grey and brown, and sometimes white with snow patches, with darker seams where ravines cut down to the water. From sea level, you see almost none of the inland complexity. The fjords and side channels, the inland seas and twisting arms, those are all hidden by the first low ridge of land. What you get is a silhouette, a profile, and along that profile a dent, a gap where the hills drop a little, where the coastline seems to fold inward. But coasts do that all the time. To a 16th century pilot, that dent could mean many things. It could be a bay, shallow and treacherous, with sandbars shifting under the influence of storms. It could be the mouth of a river, where fresh water churns the colour of the sea into muddied bands and floating debris marks the edge of a current. Or, just possibly, it could be something stranger. A deep valley flooded by the ocean, a passage that doesn't curve back on itself after a few miles but keeps going. A cut through the whole continent. Nothing in the view announces which one it is. From offshore, the opening of the strait can resemble a wide, lazy river mouth. The land on either side doesn't suddenly drop away into stark cliffs. It shoulders out into points and knobs that partly hide what lies inside. The water surface doesn't tell you much either. At slack tide, the Atlantic swell can roll straight past the entrance as if it were solid coast, its energy breaking on outer headlands instead of surging into the gap. Only when wind and tide oppose each other do you start to see odd patterns, cross-chop, whirlpools, lines of ruffled water that hint at something more than a simple bay. Clouds flatten the scene even further. Low stratus or drizzle smears the horizon, erasing the subtleties of hill height and valley shadow that might otherwise catch a cautious eye. At dawn or dusk, contrast collapses. Land and sky become bands of nearly the same grey. On some days, visibility shrinks to a handful of miles, and the coast only appears in pieces between squalls. You might sail past the entrance by 10 or 15 miles, and never even notice that the coastline's shape had changed. Yet, this is exactly the zone where decisions have to be made. Magellan and his pilots knew in a vague way that somewhere along this latitude there might be a passage. Portuguese and Spanish rumours, fragments of charts, maybe indigenous reports filtered through several layers of translation, all suggested that at a certain distance south the land broke, but somewhere along this latitude still leaves hundreds of miles of jagged shoreline. Faced with another recess in that shore, they had to decide, do we turn in or keep going? Every option carried its own dangers. Entering meant committing to unknown waters bounded by rock. If it was only a bay, they might spend days or weeks probing its arms, anchoring every night in dubious shelter, losing precious time and provisions. A sudden willy-war, a violent gust pouring down from the hills, could rip ships from their anchors and drive them ashore. If the channel narrowed unexpectedly, there might be no room to turn a cumbersome carrack around. Anchoring outside, just to have a look from a safer distance, posed other risks. The outer coast was no gentle lee. Atlantic storms could blow up quickly, forcing them off their anchors or threatening to dash hulls against the very land they were trying to examine. Sending in a boat exposed a handful of men to squalls, currents, and the possibility of being cut off from the fleet by a change of wind or mist that swallowed them whole. Sailing on, choosing not to investigate, was a gamble too. Each headland they rounded without turning inward might be the one that guarded the only viable passage. Push too far south, and they risked running into pack ice or simply reaching the physical end of the continent with no way west in sight, provisions dwindling, patience exhausted. Backtracking in those conditions was not just embarrassing, it was potentially fatal. So the risk calculus became almost psychological. Pilots argued from precedent. This bay looked like others that had turned out to be closed. That headland had a certain form they associated with river mouths. The colour of the water might suggest glacial runoff rather than open ocean flow. Magellan, as Captain General, weighed those impressions against his own strategic need. He could not afford infinite false starts, but neither could he afford to miss the one opening that mattered. And always over their shoulders the weather watched. In these latitudes, weather isn't background. It is the main actor. A clear, sharp day with good visibility could turn in an hour into curtains of sleet, wind shifts, and low cloud that erased the line between land and water. A following wind that had pushed them south might suddenly swing against them the moment they tried to nose into a suspicious gap. Fog could lie in the entrance like a living thing, offering nothing but a grey wall where, on the chart in Magellan's head, there needed to be certainty. Later artists did not love this ambiguity. When they painted or engraved Magellan's discovery of the strait, they preferred theatrics. The entrance becomes narrow and stark, framed by looming cliffs or dramatic snow peaks, as if the earth itself is parting before the will of a heroic navigator. The sea inside is calm, reflective, inviting. The sky is clear enough to bathe the whole scene in revelation. The surviving accounts are quieter. They talk about coasts that seem to open and many bays and inlets examined and rejected. They mention soundings, cautious approaches, nights at anchor with uncertain shelter and shifting winds. When they finally describe the entrance that led into the true strait, the language is surprisingly restrained, an arm of the sea, a channel among many, chosen as much because the tides and depths felt right as because the view struck them with sudden certainty. First contact with the strait, then, was not a trumpet blast. It was a moment when one more unremarkable gap in an unending coastline had to be treated as different, without any guarantee that it was. A decision made under low clouds in cold wind, with wet rigging and tired men, guided by instruments that lied a little and eyes that could not see past the first row of hills. A quiet, risky turn of the helm into a place that, at first glance, gave them no reason at all to think it led to the other side of the world. Once that decision was made, once the helm was put over, and the ships slid past the outer headlands, they did not find a simple throat leading west. They sailed into a maze. On most modern maps, the Strait of Magellan looks clear. A long, slightly crooked line connecting two wide blue spaces. You can trace it with your finger in a second. In here, out there. From the air, from a satellite, it really does resemble a channel, a continuous water road bounded by recognizable land masses. From the deck of a 16th century ship, inside the strait, none of that exists. What you see are reaches. One stretch of water ahead, bounded by land on both sides, gently bending away until it closes your horizon. You sail along it, watching the shoreline crawl by, and the question waiting for you at the far end is always the same. Does it open or stop? The strait bends constantly. It does not run neatly east-west, and it does not maintain a consistent width. In one moment, the water seems wide enough for a dozen ships to manoeuvre abreast. A few hours later, it contracts into a narrow gut where land presses in from both sides. The wind funnels and every small change in direction matters. To reach that narrow place, you first have to commit to it. From miles away, it might appear as nothing more than a darker band, where the hills draw closer together. And each time the strait turns, it creates choices. An opening appears on the right, a bay perhaps, or the mouth of a side channel. Another yawns on the left, promising its own possibilities. The main line of water ahead kinks 30 degrees and vanishes behind a bluff. None are labelled. There is no perspective from which you can see their ultimate course. For the pilots, each crossroads is a fresh dilemma. Which arm continues, and which arm curls inward to die on a mudflat, or beneath a cliff? This is how ships get trapped. A wrong choice can lead you into a cul-de-sac that takes days to disprove. You sail down a promising channel, anchor when the light fails, pick your way onward in the morning, only to find, 20 or 30 miles later, that the water shoals or the land curves back so sharply that you are effectively in a long, narrow fjord with no outlet. Turning a heavy, square-rigged ship in that confined space is not like turning a car in a driveway. It means waiting for the right wind, warping with boats and anchors, inching around while the current tugs and the rocks wait. Meanwhile, the sea itself is moving. The strait breathes with the tides of two oceans. Water surges in from the Atlantic end and from the Pacific end, meeting and parting along invisible lines. The current is not constant. It reverses, accelerates, slackens. In some narrows it can run like a river, dragging a reluctant ship along or holding it in place despite full canvas. A choice that seemed wise on a fair, gentle tide becomes dangerous when the same passage fills with racing water and swirling eddies, pushing you toward lee shores you have no room to clear. Layered onto this are the williwaws. These are sudden, violent gusts that tumble down from the hills and glaciers, born when cold, dense air accumulates inland and then spills seaward under its own weight. To the men on deck they arrive almost without warning. One moment the wind is light and variable. The next a roar comes down a valley, the rigging screams, and the ship heels until the lee rail buries in water. Anchors can drag, cables can part, a vessel that was lying safely at rest can be hurled sideways toward rock in the time it takes to shout an order. In wide ocean a squall moves you. In a labyrinth, it slams you into the walls. Progress through this world would feel painfully, almost maddeningly slow, not because the ships were incapable of sailing, but because they could never simply go. Every mile had to be tested. Soundings taken with lead and line. The lid man chanting depths from the bow. Coasts watched for breakers that hinted at hidden reefs. Wind shifts weighed against the angle of the channel ahead. If the tide opposed them in a narrows, they might anchor and wait for hours or a full day for it to turn. If visibility fell, they might stop altogether rather than risk rounding an unseen point into danger. Time stretches under those conditions. For hungry men it does not stretch kindly. Without charts worth the name, the only way to make sense of this complexity was to engrave it into memory as they went. Landmarks became precious. A particular jag of rock on a headland. A waterfall shining in a notch. A solitary twisted tree silhouetted against the sky. Pilots would assign names, sketch crude outlines on whatever paper they had, argue over whether this bay with its low sandy point was the same one they had seen 2 days before, approached now from the opposite angle. They were, in effect, drawing the strait as they were sailing it. Each evening, if conditions allowed, there would be recalculation, distances estimated by dead reckoning, bearings guessed from a compass that pointed not to any true pole, but to its own magnetic north. Depths and bottom types, the feel of mud, sand, or stone on the lead, entered into memory as much as into any written log. The next day, those mental maps guided choices at each new branching. This must be the continuation, because the land on the port side resembles what we sketched yesterday, or that opening can't be our way, because the watercolour suggests a river, not a through passage. From above it is all clear. Modern photographs show the main stem of the strait, its side fjords, its dead-end arms, laid out like a diagram. You can see where the ships should turn, where they should not, which narrows to respect and which bays to ignore. Satellite imagery flattens the uncertainty into cartographic certainty, transforming the whole convoluted system into a single comprehensible shape. But Magellan's men did not live above it. They lived inside it. At sea level, within the cold, shifting corridors of water, the strait was not a line. It was a succession of puzzles, each one demanding an answer before you were allowed to see the next. And with every mile they crept forward, they had no guarantee that the maze actually had an exit on the far side. As they inched through that maze, one thing did remain simple: the divide between ship and shore. They could not step onto most of the land they saw. The banks were steep, the water deep right up to rock, or else too shallow and treacherous for a heavy hull to approach. Often the safest option was to stay well offshore, to anchor in mid-channel and ride out the night. That meant that for long stretches the only evidence they had of any life on those dark, cold coasts came not from faces or voices but from light. The chronicles talk about those lights: faint glows along the distant shore, occasional columns of smoke by day, pale smears against low clouds. At night, pinpricks that appeared and vanished higher than you might expect, as if they were not quite on the beach but on some shelf or ledge above it. To men who had spent weeks seeing only barren slopes and hard water, each one stood out like an answered question. Someone is there. Later, cartographers would read these passages and draw conclusions. Fuego, fire, a land named for what the sailors thought they saw blazing along the southern horizon. But if we stay with the moment itself, and with what the sources actually say, it becomes a quieter thing. More tentative, we saw fires, they write. Or more carefully, we saw what we took to be fires. The most straightforward explanation is also the most human. People were living there long before any European sails arrived. Indigenous groups along those coasts used fire the way almost all cold climate foragers do, for warmth, for cooking, for working hides and bone, for keeping insects away in summer, and for coaxing game in winter. In a wet, windy place, maintaining fire is work. You do not simply light a blaze each evening and let it gutter out at dawn. You nurse embers, tend hearths, carry coals. Over generations that effort shapes habit and landscape. It is entirely plausible that Magellan's men were seeing those ordinary vital fires. Some might have been signal fires too. When unknown ships appear in your waters, you do not necessarily rush down to the beach. You watch, you warn your neighbours, you climb to a vantage point and light beacons where they will be visible up and down the channels. A line of distant smokes could mark communication, not welcome. A sudden flare on a hilltop could be more like a shout than a greeting. There is also good reason to think they sometimes saw controlled burning. Fire is one of the oldest tools for managing the edge between forest and open ground. Periodic, deliberate burns can clear underbrush, encourage certain plants, and make it easier to spot and hunt animals. A slow, creeping fire on a slope can throw up a broad curtain of smoke, visible for miles to anyone on the water. To observers who do not know the intent, it can look like the world itself is smouldering. But those are not the only possibilities, and the strait is a place that complicates even simple senses. Cold air, temperature inversions, and layers of mist can bend light in odd ways. A small flame on shore can be reflected in calm water and doubled or tripled, or stretched into a wavering band that seems to hang above the surface rather than rest on it. Under certain conditions, you can get mirage-like effects, shimmering images displaced from their true position, lights appearing higher or lower than they actually are. a reflection of the moon in water, distorted by ripples and seen through blowing spray, can look uncannily like a ghostly fire behind the first row of hills. A lightning strike on a distant peak, followed by a brief patch of glowing cloud, might be remembered, in retrospect, as one more unexplained light on the land. The men themselves were not ideal instruments. They were cold, often soaked, running on thin rations and interrupted sleep. Eyes that have stared all day into grey haze do strange things at night. A flicker that might, under kinder circumstances, be dismissed as nothing special can grow into an event when you are already primed to believe you have reached the far edge of the world. In those conditions, ambiguity hardens quickly into story. Someone calls down from the foremast, a fire on the starboard shore. Others squint, see something, perhaps the same light, perhaps a different one, and agree. The observation goes into a pilot's notebook, then into a formal report. By the time it reaches a court chronicler in Spain, it has become plural, impressive. A land full of fires, a coast all burning. Once written that way, the phrase acquires its own momentum. Mapmakers in Seville and Antwerp are not standing on a freezing deck, trying to separate smoke from cloud. They are working with ink, an inherited authority. If the account says there were many fires, they will label the region accordingly. Land of Fire sounds memorable, dramatic, fitting for a new limit of the known world. The name pins the impression to the page, and over time the impression becomes the fact people think they know. What the crew actually saw was probably a mix of things: real hearths, signal beacons, hunting burns, odd reflections, the occasional trick of weather and tired vision. But inside the strait, in that moment, they had no way to disentangle those threads. To them, each glow on the horizon was simply another sign that the maze they were threading was not empty. There were watchers on the shore. The next question was who those watchers were, and what, if anything, they were trying to say. The shores of the strait were not empty. Archaeology, later accounts, and oral histories all point to a simple truth. People had been moving through that tangled world of islands and channels for a very long time before Magellan's masts appeared on the horizon. But moving through is the important part. Most of the indigenous groups in that region were not village-bound farmers. They were mobile hunters, gatherers, and seafaring peoples whose territories were measured less in fenced fields and more in routes. Coves visited at certain tides, winter camps in sheltered bays, summer shelters nearer to rich fishing grounds. They followed animals, seasons, and opportunities. A place could be heavily used over generations and still leave very little of the kind of permanent mark a passing sailor would recognize as a town. So even in a landscape threaded with human paths, an outsider could sail past hour after hour and see nothing that looked like habitation. From the decks of a 16th century ship, visibility was a narrow thing. You looked for certain signs: stone walls, rows of houses, cleared patches of land, obvious fields of cultivation, processions of people on a beach. Most of these would never appear in the fjord-like cuts of the strait. A family's camp might sit behind a low rise tucked under the lee of a hill to escape the wind. Canoes could be pulled up into the grass, turned over, and from mid-channel they would vanish into the colour of the shore. What you might notice instead were the traces of movement. A sudden cluster of birds rising from a headland, a thin spiral of smoke that wasn't there an hour before, the briefly seen bow of a canoe as it slipped from one rock shadow to another. To people who read that landscape every day, those were clear signs of neighbours, kin, or strangers. To a crew staring from 50 or 100 ship lengths away, they could easily register as accidents of nature. This is why, in so many early voyages, the Europeans seem to meet the land itself before they meet the people who use it. They remark on bays and promontories, on the colour of soil, on the shape of trees. They name capes and inlets. Only later, sometimes days later, do human figures enter the story, and even then often at a distance. We saw some men on the shore, we saw a canoe, we saw traces of habitation. The priority was practical. They were looking for anchorages, fresh water, safe passages. The landscape spoke directly to those needs. The communities that already knew every rock and eddy often chose not to. For the people on shore, an unknown three-masted ship was not a curiosity to rush toward. It was a problem to solve. Do you approach? Do you observe? Do you send a smaller, faster craft to circle at a distance and see what these newcomers do when startled? If your whole way of life depends on staying mobile and avoiding unnecessary risk, the first instinct is usually to watch without being seen. So the Europeans often saw the backs of conversations they did not hear. A canoe that turns away just as you notice it might not be fleeing in terror. It might be doing exactly what its occupants had planned all along, staying just beyond bowshot, circling to a better vantage point, moving to warn another camp. A cluster of tents struck and gone by the time you land on a beach does not mean the place was empty yesterday. It might mean the people who slept there knew how long it takes a ship's boat to reach shore and chose to be elsewhere. Into that gap between presence and perception, misunderstanding flows very easily. There was also the problem of language, and not just spoken language. Every gesture, every object, every arrangement of space on shore could be misread by eyes trained in a very different world. Imagine seeing a small fire on a headland and 2 or 3 figures standing beside it. One of them raises an arm. Is it a greeting, a warning, a signal to someone behind the ridge? The chronicler writing later may report they made signs to us, but what those signs meant, or were intended to mean, is left untranslatable. Canoes themselves carried messages if you knew how to read them. A light, narrow boat with only 1 or 2 people aboard, staying close to rocks, might be a scouting craft. A wider canoe with women, children, bundles and dogs might indicate movement of households, not war parties. For the Europeans, peering across water and wind, all of these became simply canoes. The nuance fell away in the spray between. Even camps could lie to foreign eyes. A few hides stretched on poles, some baskets, a skin boat hauled up on shore. This could be a full functioning home in a mobile society, the centre of a network of relations and obligations stretching along many miles of coast. To a seaman thinking in terms of walled towns and stone churches, it might appear temporary, fragile, almost negligible. Few, poor, without order. The words sometimes used in later accounts say more about the observer's expectations than about the richness of the lives being lived there. Over all of this hung the constant possibility of violence, felt most sharply by the men on the ships. They were in a narrow channel they did not understand, with limited room to manoeuvre. They knew nothing of who controlled which stretch of shore, or what older rivalries and alliances might be stirred up by their passage. In such a setting, fear of ambush was not a fantasy. It was a reasonable concern. A handful of archers or slingers on the right ledge could make a ship's deck a deadly place. Fear sharpens attention, but it also distorts it. A few figures watching from a ridge can become, by the time the story is retold, the natives lying in wait, a single arrow shot to warn you off, or to test your reaction, can be remembered later as an attempt to kill us. Silence and distance are filled with imagined motives. Caution hardens into the idea of a hostile land, peopled by lurking threats. Once that tone sets in, the written record follows it. Ships' logs and formal narratives only record what someone chose to write down, and often only what they thought their patrons back home needed to hear. A quiet day in which nothing much happened, no trade, no attack, no dramatic gesture across the water, might leave no line in a journal. A shoreline watched carefully, and found merely to be watching back, vanishes into white space on the page. But blank space in a log does not equal blank space on the land. People may have been following along the coast for days, landing where the ships could not, observing from behind low dunes, speaking about these strangers at their own hearths at night. Children may have been warned to stay away from the beaches. Canoes may have shifted routes to avoid a direct encounter. None of that leaves a neat entry in a European notebook. When we read those notebooks now, centuries later, it is tempting to mirror their silence. To imagine a desolate strait, sparsely peopled, discovered in a meaningful sense, because the logs say so little about the humans already there. But if we put mobility, caution, and misinterpretation back into the picture, the scene changes. The ships are not gliding through an empty maze. They are passing, briefly and incompletely, through someone else's lived-in world. From that misunderstanding of presence, another illusion was already taking shape. The illusion of the land itself, the way mountains, snow, and sky combined to persuade the crew they had truly reached the end of the world. From the moment they entered the strait, the land itself was performing a kind of trick. On a chart, the region looks almost manageable. A sinuous channel, a few side inlets, mountains marked with neat little hashores. But that is the view from above, from a God's eye map that no one in 1520 possessed. From the moving deck of a ship confined to a narrow corridor of water, everything about scale becomes unreliable. Distances foreshorten. A headland that looks close enough to reach in half an hour can quietly sit 3 or 4 miles away. A ridge that seems low and gentle when the sky is clear can, in the next hour's fog, loom like a wall. Your horizon is pinched between slopes. You do not see open plains receding into the distance. You see rock, and above it more rock, capped with shining white. And that white is where the illusion deepens. In the latitudes of the strait, snow is not a rare, dramatic visitor. It is part of the background. Even in late spring and summer, higher elevations can keep their snow caps. In autumn and winter, the line of white creeps lower and lower down the slopes until, from sea level, it can look as though the mountains are made entirely of ice. But the snow line is not fixed. It rises and falls with temperature, with recent storms, with the angle of the sun. Clouds drag their bellies across the peaks, hiding some ridges, revealing others. One day you may see black rock and scrub breaking through the white. The next, after a snowfall and a shift in light, the same range looks uniform, cold, seamless. If you are a mariner from Seville or Lisbon, used to seeing snow only on the far tops of the Sierra Nevada or the Pyrenees, this moving snow line sends a powerful message. You are going south, and the world is changing under your keel. From mid-channel, the mind does something very simple and very misleading. It takes vertical height and turns it into horizontal distance. The higher the mountain ahead, the farther from beyond it must be. Towering snow suggests vastness behind it, and that suggestion seeps into every description. Endless mountains, very high lands, frightful coasts, phrases like these, are as much about perception as they are about geology. The water adds another layer of uncertainty. These channels are carved by ice and tectonics, cut deep and then flooded. Soundings in such places can go from relatively shallow to unmeasurably deep within a short row of oars. Lead lines return nothing but no bottom at many fathoms, and that phrase alone can tilt the imagination. If you cannot touch the seabed with your tools, if the land rises almost sheer from that unseen depth, you are effectively moving between cliffs built on darkness. No one on those decks knew how wide the continental shelves were, or how the fjords twisted inland. They knew only that the line between ship and shore was narrow, the margin for error thin, and the water beneath them apparently bottomless. When you add to that the groan of timbers, the grind of anchor cables, the whine of wind funneled between peaks, the end of the world stops sounding like poetry and starts sounding like a reasonable description of how it felt. The sky participated in the illusion too. In those southern latitudes, weather systems move quickly. Clear morning light can turn the mountains crisp and close, every gully and ledge outlined. By afternoon, low cloud can descend into the valleys, erasing the bases of the slopes. Peaks seem to float, detached milky islands hanging in a grey sea of mist. A sailor watching that from a heaving deck does not see a passing inversion layer. He sees the land itself coming apart, becoming ghostly, less real. At dawn and dusk the angles become stranger still. Sunlight scraping along the ridges throws some faces into blinding brilliance and others into deep shadow. What looked like a single mass becomes a chain of overlapping ranges. An inlet that seemed like a dead end shows a sudden bright crack of water far inland. And now no one is sure where the main channel runs. In these half-lit hours you can watch coastlines appear and vanish, simply because of how light and water conspire with your moving viewpoint. Geology and climate give us a good sense of what those men were actually in the middle of. The region is part of the Andean system, where the mountains plunge directly into the sea. The rocks are a mixture of old crystalline cores, more recent volcanic intrusions, and heavily glaciated valleys. The strait itself is a drowned glacial trough, bordered by ranges that can rise over 1,000 meters within a short horizontal distance. The climate is cool, temperate maritime, frequent storms, strong westerly winds, heavy precipitation, snow at elevation for much of the year. In practical terms, that meant persistent cloud on the peaks, rain or sleet on many days, gusts that could come slamming down the valleys without much warning, and a landscape whose outlines were constantly being redrawn by mist, shadow, and reflection. There would have been days of sudden clarity too, brilliant blue skies and sharp horizons, but the voyage's most vivid memories, and the stories that grew from them, were more likely attached to the dramatic weather, the snow squalls, the darkened ridges, the sense of being held in a grey stone throat. Later storytellers leaned hard into those moments. By the time chroniclers wrote for courts and printers set type for an audience that would never sail south of the equator, the raw, confusing impressions of the strait had already begun to crystallize into images. End of the world was not just a feeling anymore. It became a motif. Mountains grew taller in the retelling. Snows grew deeper. Winds became more constant, the waters more hostile, the coasts more savage. Part of that is the natural exaggeration of adventure tales. A dangerous passage becomes more impressive if it seems nearly impossible. Part of it is ideological. Presenting the strait as a sublime, terrifying threshold underscored the courage of the men who forced it and the glory of the monarchs who sent them. A narrow, complex, weather-tossed channel in a cold, wet corner of the planet became, in narrative, a mythic gateway at the margin of the habitable world. But beneath the myth, the core experience was real enough. Tiny human figures on creaking wooden hulls, hemmed in by steep snow-streaked walls, sailing over depths they could not measure, under skies that changed faster than their charts could hope to. They were not seeing an objective map of South America. They were seeing a moving illusion of land, light, water, and fear, and that illusion would shape not only how they remembered the strait, but how they moved through it, how they rationed food, how they judged risk, when they turned back, and when they pushed on into waters that, on any reasonable morning, looked like a terrible place to linger. The landscape was not the only thing closing in. From the moment they passed the entrance, the strait was also a clock. Not a clock they could see with hands and numbers, but a slow, invisible countdown measured in barrels and casks and sacks of grain. Every ocean voyage in 1520 was shadowed by scarcity. Ships could not carry infinite food or water. Even at departure, rations were calculated with a kind of hopeful arithmetic. If the voyage takes this long, and each man receives this much per day, and spoilage stays within expected bounds, then the supplies will last. The strait disrupted that equation. Progress was never straight line. Some days they could move 10 or 15 miles with a following wind. Other days they might claw a single headland's worth of distance before a squall forced them to anchor again. Each stalled day consumed almost as much food as a day of good sailing. To the men, the place did not feel like a channel to be crossed. It felt like a room they had been locked inside, doing circles, burning down their stores. The rationing measures that followed were not only about hunger, they were about cognition. When you cut a man's food, you do not just shrink his body. You narrow his perception. Reduced calories dull attention, slow reaction time, flatten mood. Decisions that would have seemed manageable in Seville begin to feel insurmountable when your belly is half empty and your sleep broken by cold and noise. We know from later expeditions how quickly discipline and judgment can erode under strict rationing. Tempers shorten. Rumours spread faster. Every new inlet looks like a trap. Every delay feels like sabotage. Officers worry about mutiny. Sailors worry about being sacrificed to save provisions. Magellan and his captains would have known this pattern in outline, if not in modern physiological terms. They had seen hunger on the Atlantic crossing and in the long drift along the South American coast. By the time they reached the strait, they were already layering caution over scarcity. Fresh water offered both relief and anxiety. This part of the world is wet. Streams and waterfalls pour down the slopes. Snowmelt feeds countless rills. On paper, water should be abundant. In practice, it required constant work and constant judgment. You cannot simply drink from any convenient stream in an unknown land. Is there an upstream carcass? Are there mineral salts that will sicken the crew? Is the landing place sheltered enough to fill casks without breaking boats or breaking bones on the rocks? So the daily routine took on a grinding repetition. Find an anchorage by late afternoon, some indentation of the coast where depth and holding ground permit a ship to ride without dragging. Send boats ashore with barrels, assign men to cut wood, mend sails, patch hulls. Post guards, because even an apparently empty shore could hide people or animals or simply accidents if men wandered off. While this is happening, pilots and officers row out, taking soundings in the channel ahead. Lead lines swung, numbers called, notes scratched down. They are building a mental model of depths and shoals that may or may not be accurate, because the next turn in the coast can make all their labour obsolete. Day after day this cycle repeats. Anchor, scout, sound, repair, ration. Scurvy lurks in the background of all this, even though they do not yet understand its cause. They recognise patterns, gums bleeding, old wounds reopening, lethargy that sleep does not cure. They know that fresh food helps, but the strait is not a generous pantry. Cold, wind-blasted shores are poor places for easy foraging. There are shellfish, certainly, but they require time and labour to gather, and storms can make landing dangerous. There might be occasional birds, perhaps some edible plants in sheltered nooks, but nothing like the lush provisioning stops of tropical coasts. You can imagine the frustration, mountains draped in forest, slopes streaked with waterfalls, a sense of abundance all around. And yet, for men on cramped decks, the daily menu is still mostly hard biscuit, salted meat, dried legumes, maybe some oil or cheese, all of it aging, all of it edged, with the sour tang of going bad. Under such conditions time thickens, The strait itself is a few hundred kilometres long, depending on how you trace its curves and side channels. That is not trivial, but it is hardly transcontinental. Yet in the journals the experience stretches, days blur. We remained here, we anchored, we waited for a wind. Phrases like this accumulate until the geographical distance vanishes beneath the lived duration. To hungry, cold, uncertain men, the strait's length is not measured in leagues. It is measured in dwindling rations, in how many more days of half rations the crew can endure before morale breaks, in how many anchorings remain before the last cask of wine is drained, and the last barrel of biscuit holds more weevils than flour. This is one of the reasons the navigation details slip, even in careful accounts. Pilots were taking notes, bearings, estimated distances, soundings, but when those same pilots, or the scribes who worked from their reports, later set the story down for patrons and printers, what rose most vividly to the surface was not the exact angle of a headland, or the precise width of a channel. What surfaced was the feeling of being worn down, endless anchoring, sudden storms, men grumbling over meagre meals, the sensation that every mile had to be paid for twice, once in effort at the braces and once in a tighter belt at supper. Over time, that emotional headline, the hardship, the rationing, the slow grind, covered the subtler lines of the original chart. The strait became, in memory and narrative, less a puzzle of water and rock, and more a trial of endurance. A place defined not only by what the men saw, but by what they felt leaving them, their strength, their stores, their patience. And as that feeling deepened, choices that might have been purely navigational on a full stomach began to tilt towards something else. Survival calculations, retreat fantasies, the weighing of obedience against hunger. At some point in that slow erosion of patience and calories, one ship decided the strait itself was the mistake. On paper, the San Antonio was doing what a flagship might envy. She was large, well provisioned, important enough to carry a pilot who had sailed these latitudes before. She had officers with powerful friends back in Castile. If any individual hull could imagine itself as something other than a component of Magellan's plan, it was this one. We are used to hearing the word desertion and picturing cowardice in bright colours. A sudden refusal, men slinking away in the night. But what happened inside the strait would not have felt, to its participants, like one dramatic break. It would have felt like a series of arguments. Is the commander leading us into a dead end? Are we already past the point of safe return? Does obedience still equal survival, or has the balance quietly tipped? Remember, these were not abstract debates. Every officer on every ship had responsibilities. To the Crown, to Magellan's contract, to their own careers, to the men whose faces they saw at muster each morning. In the cramped cabins of the San Antonio, those loyalties would have been weighed against each other, sometimes aloud, sometimes in the long silence after a difficult conversation. Some of them had reasons to doubt Magellan before they ever saw the first white wall of a Patagonian headland. He was Portuguese operating under a Spanish flag in a court culture where nationality mattered. He had already executed and marooned conspirators during the mutiny in the winter harbour. He had pushed them down this uncharted funnel of rock and ice on the strength of calculations that no one else on board could fully verify. Imagine being a Castilian captain or pilot who had learned navigation under different teachers, different tables, different stars. You have questions you can't quite phrase without sounding disloyal. You watch your commander interpret each bend in the coast as confirmation, each setback as a test of resolve. At what point do you decide that your own judgment is the safer harbour? The decision to turn back did not need one villainous speech. It only needed a convergence of fears, fear of a strait that might not end, fear of a Pacific that, if it existed, might stretch far beyond any sane estimate of provisions, Fear that if Magellan died or lost royal favour, any survivors would be blamed for following him too far. And beneath that, a quieter arithmetic. If we leave now, we have the biggest hull, the fullest holds, the best chance of reaching Spain alive, with enough spice and news to claim we have fulfilled our duty as far as humanly possible. From the outside, from Magellan's quarterdeck, what he saw, once he realised, was theft. A royal ship, a chunk of his supplies, a substantial fraction of his men, gone without leave at the very moment when unity mattered most. For him and for his supporters, the story almost had to be framed as treachery. To admit that the deserters might have had rational doubts would be to admit that his own certainty had a crack in it. So two narratives began to crystallize, like salt on the rim of the same barrel. In one, the San Antonio is the ship that broke, the symbol of weakness, the proof that Magellan's resolve was something rarer and purer than the ordinary sailor's endurance. This is the version that fits neatly into heroic arcs. The leader presses on despite betrayal. The Strait and then the Pacific are conquered not just by seamanship, but by an almost moral stamina. In the other, less loudly told, the deserters are not cowards, but pragmatists. They are the ones who saw that the expedition had already paid too high a price in men and material. They are guardians of royal assets, rescuing what they can from a venture that looks from their vantage point, increasingly like a personal obsession in flimsy legal wrapping. Both stories lean on the same facts. A ship left. A commander continued. What changes is the frame around those facts, and who gets to hold the pen? And inside that split we get a rare glimpse of just how uncertain things felt, even after the Strait's existence was no longer theoretical. If the passage were obviously opening into a boundless ocean, if land were visibly thinning, if every day brought clearer signs of an exit, it would have been much harder to justify turning back. That the San Antonio did so tells us that, for at least some aboard, the geography still felt ambiguous enough, that retreat seemed not only possible, but sensible. Maybe the channel ahead looked like yet another cul-de-sac. Maybe cloud and snow hid crucial landmarks. Maybe the pilot's depth soundings disagreed. In a world before satellite images, we have found the way through, and we are trapped in a maze, could be, for days at a time, equally plausible interpretations of the same jagged horizon. The desertion had practical consequences that rippled outward in quiet ways. Fewer men meant lighter rations for those who remained, yes, but it also meant fewer hands for the endless labour of anchoring, rowing, repairing, sounding. Every storm after that loss landed just a little harder on the backs that were left. Every injury became more serious, because there was one fewer man to take up the slack. Supplies vanished not just in absolute quantity, but in variety. Tools, spare rigging seeds meant for future plantings, trade goods intended to smooth encounters with unknown peoples. Whatever lay in the San Antonio's hold sailed away with her. It narrowed the expedition's future options in ways that may not have been immediately apparent, but would surface months later in tiny crises. A rope that could not be replaced. A broken tool for which there was no twin. Trust, already strained by cold and hunger, took a deeper wound. If one captain could calculate his own survival separately from the fleet's, who else was quietly running the same numbers? If one royal subject could reinterpret his orders based on his own reading of the sky and shore, what did command really mean this far from court? Magellan's authority from that point on had to contend not only with storms and scurvy and headlands, but with the invisible precedent that had been set. It was now imaginable to leave. Later histories often glide over this, or compress it into a line or two. A ship deserted. The expedition carried on to the Pacific, on to the Philippines, on to the familiar beats of discovery and martyrdom. There are reasons for that compression, Grand narratives prefer clean arcs and simple allegiances. A single unified expedition, struggling heroically against nature, makes for better imperial propaganda, and, later for tidier schoolbook stories than a fleet riven by doubt, where some men decide that obedience and wisdom no longer point in the same direction. To linger on the San Antonio is to admit that even in the midst of one of history's most celebrated discoveries, people were hedging their bets, rewriting their own roles in real time. It is to admit that the strait was not just a line on the map to be traced, but a decision point, a place where men looked at the same grey water, the same serrated skyline, the same dwindling casks, and made opposite choices about what those sights meant. The straight, triumphant story of Magellan's passage begins to bend here, quietly, with the wake of the ship that turned back. When that wake smoothed out behind the San Antonio and the remaining ships edged further into the unknown, something else was happening that would prove far more permanent than any individual hull's decision. They were starting to attach words to things, not just jotting notes in a margin, not passing descriptions from watch to watch. They were minting names. And in the logic of 16th century exploration, to name a place was to do three things at once. It was to remember it, it was to tell a story about it. And it was, quietly but unmistakably, to claim it. Think about how fragile knowledge was in their world. No photographs, no charts printed by the thousands, no shared satellite imagery. A headland, a bay, a treacherous shoal existed for the wider world only if someone wrote it down in a form that others would recognize. And then that writing survived the crossing back to Europe. Names were memory hooks. If you call a narrow, confusing channel the Strait of All Saints, you're pinning it to a date in the Christian calendar, All Saints' Day. You are telling any future reader not just this exists, but we were here on this holy day. Remember us as devout men moving through a Christian time. If you call the new seen land Tierra del Fuego, land of fire, you're doing something similar. You could describe in careful prose the smoky columns they saw on the shores, the controlled burns and campfires of indigenous peoples going about their own cycles of life. But a label like Land of Fire condenses all of that into one dramatic phrase. It makes the place sound elemental, almost mythic. Later readers don't have to know whether the fires were many or few, constant or occasional, set for warmth or for signalling. The name itself does the interpretive work. It implies a landscape defined by flame, by danger, by spectacle. It nudges the mind toward a particular image before any detailed description is even read. And names like that travel better than nuance. When reports reached Spain, the Crown and its chroniclers were not looking for long caveats about weather conditions, visibility, the unreliability of distance estimates. They were looking for handles they could use in royal decrees, in maps, in sermons about Providence. The Strait of Magellan, Tierra del Fuego, Pacific Ocean. Each of those begins as a choice. Out of the many features the men on those ships could have highlighted, cold currents, the pervasive feeling of being hemmed in by mountains, they chose, or later writers chose for them, a single word or phrase to stand for the whole experience. What gets named, and what stays a scribbled note in a logbook, tells us where their attention was allowed to settle. A dangerous shoal that threatens European ships gets a saint's name and a place on the chart. A complex indigenous settlement pattern, visible only in glimpses of smoke and distant figures, is absorbed into a broad label like Giants or Savages, or simply left as background. A bay where they found shelter and fresh water may be given a name that honours a monarch, a patron, or a feast day. The people whose knowledge of that bay allowed them to survive there for generations remain unnamed, or are folded into a generic category: Indians, Patagonians. In this way, the royal and Christian frameworks the sailors carried with them began to harden into geography. The Christian calendar, which ordered their lives on land, Lent, Easter, the feast of this or that martyr, spilled out onto coastlines. Each important landfall could be pegged to a liturgical day. A cape seen on the Immaculate Conception, an island sighted on Epiphany. Over time, these devotional timestamps became features on maps. Royal references worked the same transformation. Magellan sailed under the authority of Charles I of Spain. To call a Strait of Magellan is already to tie a piece of the earth to a particular chain of patronage and permission, an officer of a given king, operating under specific capitulations, has not merely passed through, but, in the language of the day, discovered it. That word discovered is itself a kind of name. It suggests that what was seen had not really existed, in the sense that mattered, until it was folded into Iberian knowledge systems and adorned with European labels. Once you have Strait of Magellan printed on a map, all of the hesitations that attended its first traversal begin to fade. The fog, the false inlets, the arguments about latitude, the fact that one of the ships turned back, those are now marginalia. The main text is the confident line, the tidy name. The act of naming has retroactive power. It makes what was tentative feel inevitable. It turns the moment when 4 battered hulls edged through a labyrinth of ice and rock, with their crews half convinced they might be trapped, into the clean passage of Magellan through his strait. What's left out are all the features and experiences that didn't fit neatly into the available naming schemes. There is no Bay of Men who decided they'd had enough and turned around. There is no Cape of Fires belonging to people who were already here. There is no clear space on the official charts for the uneasy realization that these lands were occupied, mapped in other minds, woven into other cosmologies long before a European pilot wrote down their latitudes. Even the Pacific, named for its relative calm, compared to the stormy Atlantic they had just survived, carries a quiet distortion. The vast ocean beyond the strait would prove anything but peaceful to those who tried to cross it. But the name stuck, and with it a subtle promise. Beyond the hard passage lies tranquillity. Names like these outlive the messy testimony of the men who first used them. Pigafetta's detailed observations, the pilot's sometimes contradictory logs, the private doubts and arguments that never made it past the cramped confines of a captain's cabin, all of that is fragile. It depends on single manuscripts, on careful copying, on archivists who resist the urge to simplify. The names, by contrast, reproduce easily. They're repeated in court documents, in navigational manuals, on globes, in schoolbooks. After a few generations, people stop hearing them as interpretations and start hearing them as facts. Of course it's Tierra del Fuego. That's just what it's called. The fires become permanent, whether or not they were ever as constant or defining as the name suggests. The strait becomes singular, a line carved decisively by one man, even though its discovery and traversal were communal, uncertain, and shaped by decisions like desertion that don't fit easily into the heroic grammar of naming. By following the trail of words, we can begin to see the gap between what those sailors actually experienced in 1520 and the clean, labelled world that grew up on paper afterward. And once you notice that gap, the next step is to look at the maps themselves, to see how the inked version of the strait took on a life of its own, sometimes drifting quietly away from the jagged, confusing reality the men in those ships were trying, and often failing, to describe. When the first sketches of that passage were made, they didn't look like the tidy, confident line you might imagine. They began as something much more fragile, hurried soundings in cold water, bearings taken from a deck that would not stop moving, estimates of distance made by men whose fingers were too numb to hold a pen steadily. Those fragments went into logbooks. A pilot might write, "Sailed west-southwest, light breeze, saw land to port, soundings 20 fathoms bottom of sand and shell. Another might note, turned into a channel, believed to be the way to the west, mountains on both sides, many turns. Each entry is local, anchored to a particular moment, a particular watch. None of them by themselves look like a map. They are more like beads on a string, and sometimes the string is frayed. The transformation happens later. Somewhere in Seville, or Valladolid, or Lisbon, a cosmographer sits at a table with a pile of these beads, pilot logs, captain's reports, hearsay from returning sailors, and is asked to turn them into a single continuous curve on paper. He has never seen the place. He has to decide how to connect things that were never measured together. One log says the channel ran for many leagues. Another gives a number, 20 or 40, or perhaps that was 4, smudged by sea spray and candle smoke. A third contradicts both because its author misjudged speed in a strong current, or simply guessed. To make a map, you have to choose. So he smooths, he averages. He corrects what feels like obvious error. He straightens a bend that seems too sharp to be real. He narrows or widens a passage to keep the coastlines from crossing over each other on the page. And in the process, the strait begins to change. On paper, its width might become more regular than it ever is in life. A narrow, dangerous pinch that terrified the helmsman can expand into a generous channel, because the drawn coasts need room for labels. A broad bay where the wind died, and the ships drifted may be pinched in, because too much empty white space raises doubts. Distances drift too. A day of sailing into a headwind might be compressed to a handful of leagues. A fast run with the current at their back could be stretched into something grander, to make the accomplishment seem worthy of royal attention. Missing branches, those false inlets where they poked their noses in and then backed out, can vanish entirely from the official chart. Why clutter the King's Ocean with mistakes? Every omission is a kind of decision about what the strait really is. Then there is language. The pilots wrote in Portuguese, in Spanish, sometimes in mixtures of both. Their words were copied by scribes who might never have been at sea, then translated by clerks, whose job was not accuracy so much as producing something that fit the expectations of the Council of the Indies. A phrase like many turns and arms could become a single channel with some bends. A cautious note, we believe this leads to the West Sea, might harden into this channel opens to the Mar del Sur. Tentative verbs, full of doubt, are quietly replaced by declarative ones. Those changes feel small when you're holding a quill over a piece of paper, but they push the image of the place step by step away from the messy labyrinth the men experienced and toward the smooth corridor later readers expect. There are also reasons to nudge the ink in particular directions. For the Spanish crown, a usable passage linking the Atlantic to the newly claimed South Sea was a treasure. It meant shorter routes to spices, a way around Portuguese-controlled waters, a strategic choke point that could be defended, licensed, taxed. If the strait sounded too treacherous, too uncertain, too riddled with confusing side channels, its value shrank. So a cosmographer, consciously or not, might exaggerate its clarity. The bends become gentle, predictable curves. The number of days required to pass through shrinks. Dangerous shoals and baffling bays drop away, leaving a slim, purposeful line that proves God and King had smiled on the enterprise. On the other hand, there were also incentives to emphasize its difficulty. If access to the Pacific could be painted as something only expert Spanish pilots could manage, so much the better for maintaining control. A map that suggests hidden dangers just off the plotted route supports policies that restrict navigation to authorized men trained in royal knowledge. So you might see the same passage drawn, in different contexts, as both inviting and perilous. Straight enough to exist, intricate enough to require a particular empire's guidance. Later cartographers inherit these first attempts and feel an obligation to improve them. They compare one chart to another, notice discrepancies in width or orientation, and resolve them with the tools of geometry and imagination. If an early map shows the strait angling too far north, but a new astronomical observation pins its latitude differently, the entire channel is rotated on the page. The coastlines shift, the curves are redrawn, rivers are added when none were observed, because an elegant pattern of drainage is easier to accept than empty mountains. Extraneous inlets disappear because they make the whole composition look untidy. Over time, draftsmen begin to prioritize coherence over fidelity to any one logbook. They are less interested in what it felt like to grope through in 1520, and more interested in how the channel fits into a larger, orderly globe. The paradox is that with each correction, the map gains authority. Printed, engraved, copied again and again, the neat version of the strait becomes familiar. Mariners are taught its shape in navigation schools. Scholars trace its line in atlases. Children see it on classroom globes. A captain who later sails through and finds that the channel is narrower here, wider there, more crooked than the lines suggest, may trust the ink more than his own memory. He assumes he has erred. The map, after all, has been sanctioned by experts and kings. The paper strait begins to outrank the water strait. People start speaking of the passage as if there is only one way through, even though the original explorers argued over which arm led where. The legend of Magellan's clean cut across the continent solidifies, supported not by the shivering testimonies of men on deck, but by the serene certainty of lines on vellum. By the time we inherit the story, the sequence is reversed in our minds. We imagine the map first, as if Magellan sailed along a route already printed for him, and then the experience. But historically it was the other way around: confusion, cold argument, fear, and only then, much later, a line. To see what really happened in 1520, we have to peel back those layers of ink and go back to the words that fed them, to the primary sources that still carry, in their hesitations and contradictions, the shape of the strait as it was actually felt. When we talk about primary sources for Magellan's voyage, it sounds solid and reassuring, as if we can just open a box, pull out the truth, and read it. What we actually have is a small, uneven stack of voices, each speaking from a different position on the same deck. There is Antonio Pigafetta, a gentleman volunteer from Vicenza, educated, devout, attached to Magellan personally. He kept a detailed account, later polished into a narrative meant for high-ranking patrons. His rank gave him access to officers' discussions, charts, rumours from the quarterdeck. It also meant he had reasons to defend certain decisions, and to present the voyage as a meaningful, almost providential story, not just a string of mishaps and near mutinies. There are pilots' logs and relations, some anonymous, some attributed. These men cared about bearings, depths, and winds. Their notes tend to be terse, pragmatic, more interested in how do we get through this alive than what does it all mean. But pilots served under captains, and captains served under the crown. A pilot who wrote that his commander was lost, or that the strait seemed impassable, risked his career, perhaps worse. There are letters and reports written after the voyage by men who survived other legs of the journey, or who turned back. These are shaped by hindsight, by legal proceedings, by the need to explain why they came home early, or why others did not come home at all. Self-justification hangs in the margins like mist. And then there are the official summaries, compiled for councils and kings. These flatten multiple testimonies into one version, with an audience of monarchs, ministers and investors in mind. Failure is softened, doubt is trimmed. Treason is highlighted when convenient, underplayed when awkward. All of these are primary, none of them are neutral. You can feel the difference most clearly when you compare the raw, day-by-day notes to the later, smoothed stories. A log entry from a pilot might sound almost bored. Sailed 2 leagues, many turns, wind, contrary, anchored. No comment on the mood of the men, no mention of fear, no lingering on the cliffs rising on both sides. That kind of detail slows the hand and wastes ink. Pigafetta, writing later, remembers the same period as a time of almost mystical significance. Mountains that seemed to touch the sky, waters so deep the lead gave no bottom, miraculous guidance through the maze. His narrative stretches, lingers, frames the passage as a test that proves Magellan's genius and God's favour. Between those two styles, something happens. The daily record is like a heartbeat, steady, repetitive, often dull. The polished narrative is like a memory retold at a banquet, sharpened in places, blurred in others, tuned to an audience that wants shape, not just sequence. And there are the silences. Almost nothing in the surviving Spanish and Italian accounts tells us what the indigenous people of those shores said, thought, or felt. We hear that fires were seen. We hear that some giants appeared, that they made signs, that they fled. Their languages are reduced to a handful of words, often filtered through interpreters who barely understood them. Entire worlds of meaning never made it onto the page. Environmental nuance disappears too. The logs record wind direction and rough weather, storm, calm, fog. But how did the air smell? How loud were the tides in the night? How did the sound change when the channel narrowed, or when ice floated past from a distant glacier? These things mattered to men on deck, but paper favours numbers and nouns over sensations. Crew descent is mostly absent from the day-to-day entries. We know of mutinies and grumbling from later testimonies, from trials, from Pigafetta's careful phrasing. But in the moment a pilot did not usually write. The men are losing faith, or we no longer trust the captain. That kind of honesty could be read back against him. So the paper stays calm, even when the ship was not. When these texts cross languages, they change again. Pigafetta wrote in a hybrid Italian, salted with Spanish and Portuguese sea terms. Scribes copied his work. Later translators rendered it into French, Latin, modern Spanish, modern English. Each time choices were made. A phrase like "men feared greatly" can be softened into "the crew was uneasy." Cautious it seemed to us that this channel might lead to the South Sea becomes "this channel leads to the Pacific Ocean." Adverbs and modal verbs might, perhaps it appeared, often get shaved away in translation, leaving bare confident statements. Editors trim too. Passages that digress into lists of fish, birds, or local plants can be cut to keep the story moving. Repetitive notes about turning this way and that are streamlined. Empty days, when nothing happened except cold and waiting at anchor, disappear between chapters. The resulting narrative feels more purposeful, less like groping through a labyrinth, and more like following a destined route. By the time we read it, it is easy to mistake that smoothness for accuracy. A careful approach treats every vivid detail as possible, not guaranteed. When Pigafetta describes mountains as high as the sky or men of extraordinary stature, we can accept that something struck him powerfully without taking the description literally. When one log records a swift, easy run through a reach of the strait, and another hints at days of tacking in contrary winds, we can suspect that memory, pride, or simple error have bent the timeline. Instead of asking, "What did Magellan see?" as if there is one single clean answer, we can ask, what could a man in his position, with his instruments, his fears and his obligations, have perceived and then chosen to write down? The primary sources do not give us the strait itself. They give us traces of how a few particular men, standing on specific decks, under specific chains of command, tried to make sense of a place that did not yet have a name, or rather a place that already had names, in languages they never wrote down. To understand what Magellan likely saw in 1520, we have to read those traces with sympathy and suspicion at the same time. Let them guide us, but not dictate to us. Hold their certainties lightly and pay just as much attention to where they fall silent. By the time those traces reach us in school books and documentaries, they have usually been arranged into something much cleaner than anything the pilots or Pigafetta ever experienced. In the popular version, Magellan discovers the strait almost by accident, peers into it with a navigator's sixth sense, and then calmly leads his ships through a single continuous channel to the Pacific. The winds cooperate just enough. The route is difficult but legible. The land around them is dramatic but empty. The men are impressed, perhaps awed, but essentially passengers on a great man's moment. It is a satisfying story. It has a clear beginning, finding the entrance, an orderly middle, the heroic passage, and an obvious end, sailing out into the new ocean. It feels inevitable, as if a door had always been waiting there for the right hand to turn the key. The surviving evidence points to something much messier. Think back to the pilot's laconic notes. Many turns, contrary winds, anchored. Think of Pigafetta's insistence on labyrinths, on channels that seem to end in mountains, on the need to send ships ahead to scout. That is not the language of a man gliding down a known path. It is the language of people inching forward, half expecting to find a dead end around the next bend. Rather than an effortless discovery, what likely happened was a phased, nervous recognition, an opening that might be a bay or a river mouth, but might also be something more. Careful sounding of depths, days of probing side inlets and backing out again. Arguments on the quarterdeck about whether to risk going farther in or to retreat and keep looking along the coast. The strait in 1520 was not yet the Strait of Magellan. It was a tangle of unknown waters between unknown lands. The popular image of a clear, singular passage hides how partial their knowledge had to be. At no point could any man aboard those ships see the whole system. No one climbed high enough or waited long enough to trace the entire route from Atlantic to Pacific with his eyes. They experienced it as a sequence of reaches, anchorages, and decisions, each one made with limited visibility and imperfect maps. When later writers describe Magellan as if he had the modern atlas in his head, a vision of the passage, a plan to thread it in one go, that is a projection backward. It is us, standing outside time, drawing a line on a map, and then imagining that someone in 1520 could stand on a cold deck and see that same line. Isolation is another drift. We are often told or allowed to assume that Magellan's fleet sailed through a stage set stripped of other actors. Empty shores, silent forests, only the occasional distant fire, or a fleeting encounter with giants, quickly folded into marvel. But the mere fact that they saw fires along the land, sometimes many, sometimes few, suggests a human landscape more continuous than the narratives admit. People were hunting, travelling, fishing, watching. They had their own routes, their own names for the channels, their own stories about the sea and the sky. The Europeans were not alone in the strait. They were simply unable or unwilling to record most of the company they kept. Why then do we inherit the neat version? Part of the reason lies in the needs of later centuries. As rival empires grew, the story of Magellan's passage became raw material for national pride. Spain wanted a heroic pioneer who would open a royal highway to the Indies. Portugal wanted either a traitor to condemn or a genius they had failed to keep. Later still, European and American historians wanted clear turning points in the Age of Discovery, scenes after which the world could be said to be permanently changed. Heroes and turning points do not sit well with confusion, backtracking, or the possibility that local people had a deeper, older knowledge of the same waters. So the hesitation is compressed, the blind alleys fade. The long, still nights at anchor shrink to a sentence. We waited some days for better weather. In that smoothing process, genuine mysteries get blended with inventions. There are still things we do not know about the 1520 passage. The exact identity and locations of the indigenous groups seen along different stretches, the precise route taken through certain side channels, the full extent of Magellan's own doubts, hopes, or private calculations. These are real gaps. A careful historian will mark them, admit them, sit with them. Layered around those are modern embellishments that respond more to our taste for spectacle than to the sources. Stories of gigantic Patagonians towering a head and shoulders above any modern human. Tales of Magellan naming the Pacific, because the waters were magically, universally calm when the logs described gales not long after. Claims that no European had ever suspected a passage before, when earlier charts and rumours hint at possibilities, guesses, whispers of a strait long before anyone confirmed it. Sensational retellings blur these distinctions. A blank in the record becomes an invitation to spin a dramatic scene. A single ambiguous phrase becomes a monster, a miracle, a revelation. A more balanced framing asks quieter questions. Given the ships they had, the instruments they carried, the winds and currents they reported, how likely is it that they coasted through without serious fear? Given what we know of other voyages in similar waters, how probable is complete isolation from local people? When a source uses language that could mean very large or unusually tall, how justified are we in turning that into a race of giants? For each claim, we can sort it gently into one of three baskets. There are things that are strongly supported, that they passed through a multi-branched channel system at roughly this latitude, over roughly this span of weeks, facing cold, hunger, and growing strain. There are things that are possible but uncertain, which exact inlet they anchored in on a particular day. What an unnamed pilot muttered under his breath. What an indigenous family thought as strange ships slid past their fishing ground. And there are things that are, quite plainly, later inventions. Smooth lines of dialogue, sudden flashes of insight, clean moral lessons attached to events that must have felt chaotic at the time. Holding the story this way does not make it less wondrous. If anything, it deepens the wonder, because instead of a single man striding through a door no one else had ever noticed, we get a picture of fallible, shivering people feeling their way along an edge they barely understood, while unseen watchers on the shore and in distant huts listened to the same winds and gave them different meanings. And once we accept that the neat version is a construction, not a transcript, we can let our minds slow down with the fleet again and ask a gentler question. If you had been standing on that deck, in that cold, with those charts and those fears, how would the strait have appeared to you day by day, bend by uncertain bend? We will pause with that thought for a moment before we let the story move on. Let your attention soften for a moment. We are still with the ships, still in that narrow, changeable world of rock and water and wind. But before we follow them out toward the open ocean, you can let the pace in your mind slow even more. Stories like this one, where the evidence is partial and the legends have done a lot of rearranging, are part of a larger pattern. Our records are full of voyages, events, and places that do not quite match the versions we grew up with. Sometimes the gaps are tiny, a missing day, a miscopied name. Sometimes the gaps are wide enough that whole myths can slip through. If you find that kind of quiet puzzle relaxing, there is a book waiting for you whenever you want it. On the website linked in the description, you'll find a collection of 12 unexplained historical mysteries, each treated in this same slow, careful way. No jump scares, no breathless certainty, just the surviving evidence, the possible interpretations, and the calm pleasure of seeing where the line between what we know and what we imagine actually lies. For this week it's available at a discount, so if you'd like something to drift off with after this, you can explore that whenever you feel ready. For now, stay here. The fleet has not yet reached the Pacific. In our everyday maps, the strait is a thin, decisive cut between two enormous bodies of water, a clean line you can trace with a fingertip. In 1520, for the men aboard those ships, it is still a long, uncertain corridor with no guarantee of an exit. Each day they move, but they do not know whether they are advancing toward a passage, circling inside a dead-end basin, or edging back toward the very ocean they left. That uncertainty shapes what they think they see. A modern reader, already armed with the term Strait of Magellan, tends to project a simple before and after. Before the discovery, Atlantic ignorance. After the discovery, Pacific enlightenment. But on board, in those weeks, there is no clear dividing line. There is only a sequence of impressions, sudden gusts, deceptive calms, glimpses of distant peaks, and the ongoing effort to turn those impressions into a coherent picture. We remain in that moment of not yet knowing. If you imagine standing there, the difference between strait and bay, between channel and trap, is not a label on a map. It is the difference between living and dying, between adding your name to a royal report and vanishing into a blank space that future cartographers will quietly colour over. This is why the question of perception versus legend matters. Not because the legend is evil, or because we must strip stories down to bare facts, but because the way the legend is shaped can conceal the emotions and decisions that were very real at the time. Later ages would polish this experience into a single dramatic arc. Magellan seeks a passage. Magellan finds a passage. Magellan uses the passage to enter a new ocean. Each clause is neat, final, self-contained. Inside the strait, nothing feels final. Every apparent conclusion is only provisional. A channel that seems to bend toward the west might, tomorrow, reveal itself as a cul-de-sac. A promising current might slacken. A wind that has been helping them along might suddenly reverse and hold them pinned against an unseen reef. The pilots are reading each day's signs with the same mixture of expertise and guesswork that we use when we interpret any incomplete record. You can think of it as a kind of living archive. The ships advance a little, and the crew collects another line in the log, another sketch in the margin of a chart, another rumour traded over a low-voiced conversation at night. As they go, the sum of those impressions begins to lean in one direction, toward the idea that this is not just a bay, not just a maze, but a throughway. Still, they cannot be sure. Only we from our distant vantage point can say, yes, this was the passage. Yes, on the far side lies the Pacific. From their perspective, the Pacific is not yet a real ocean. It is an expectation, a hoped-for release, a set of calculations about latitude and longitude and vague testimonies from earlier sailors who thought there might be something beyond the American mainland. When the strait finally does open onto that vast body of water, the story will not cleanly flip from mystery to clarity. It will slide instead into a different kind of misunderstanding. Because the ocean they meet is not the same Pacific we imagine when we picture a smooth blue expanse filling half the globe. It is for them a local phenomenon, a stretch of water that happens to be calm when they enter it, that happens to run with currents and winds their instruments can only partially grasp. From that limited bodily experience, those particular days, those particular conditions, Magellan's crew will construct a name, Pacific, and a first mental image of what lies beyond the Cape. Later generations will inherit that name and that image, then slowly bend them, through charts and trade routes and national stories, into something quite different. We are poised at that hinge. Behind us, in the strait, is a world of near constant doubt, where every shoreline can mean many things at once. Ahead lies an ocean that will seem, in the telling, clearer and more decisive than it ever was on board. As we move on, we will watch how that shift happens, how a single ambiguous exit from a labyrinth becomes, in retrospect, the confident first step into a boundless sea. For now, you can let yourself remain in the narrow waters a little longer, breathing with the slow advance of the ships, knowing that the so-called moment of discovery is not a flash, but a long exhale that has not yet finished. The first hint that they were nearing the end was not a grand vista. It was a change in the water. For weeks, the men had lived inside the texture of the strait, short, confused waves bouncing back from rock walls, cross-currents tugging the hull from two directions at once, winds funneled and accelerated by narrow passages. The sea there was cramped, like sound echoing in a small room. As they pushed westward, that feeling began to loosen. The swell grew longer, slower, more regular. Instead of choppy, intersecting ripples, there were broad, even undulations moving under the ships. The pilots would have felt it in their footing before they ever saw a horizon line open, the deck rising and falling with a rhythm that belonged to water which had travelled a long way without being broken by land. Experienced sailors did not need a name like Pacific to recognise that change. They had felt it leaving Europe, crossing the open Atlantic before turning south. A big ocean leaves its handwriting on the hulls that ride it. But even that is not an instant realization. A single day of calmer swell could be a fluke, a weather pattern, some hidden basin where waves had space to stretch. So they watched, they recorded, winds, bearings, soundings, the look of the sky. The logbooks from this part of the voyage are not exclamation marks. They are notes, clipped observations that accumulate until a pattern emerges. The shoreline was changing too. Inside the strait, the land had often crowded in close, steep, irregular, dark against the sky. Capes appeared suddenly, channels angled away and then back. As they neared the western exit, the contours began to open. The headlands were still there, but they no longer penned the ships in on every side. Gaps widened, vistas stretched. For someone reading about it later, with a neat line on a map in front of them, it is tempting to imagine a simple threshold. One moment they are hemmed in, the next they are looking out into an endless blue. But the world rarely obliges us with such perfect transitions. More likely, the recognition came in layers. On one day, the pilots notice that the current is running steadily in one direction, not circling back as it often had inside. On another, they note that the soundings' measurements of depth suggest deeper water ahead, not a rising bottom that might warn of a dead-end shore. On another still, the men on deck see fewer cliffs and more low, distant outlines, the kind of land that frames a sea rather than walls it off. Each of these impressions on its own could be interpreted in multiple ways. Together, they began to point toward a conclusion. They were not in a basin. They were approaching an opening. Emotionally, that shift would have been complicated. Relief, yes. The Atlantic behind them had become, by then, not just a body of water, but a symbol of all the risk already endured, storms, scurvy, mutiny, the grind of months at sea. The strait had added its own catalogue of fears, shoals, unknown tides, the possibility of being trapped in some inner channel and forced to turn back defeated. To feel the swell grow long, to see the sky open wider ahead, was to sense that at least one part of the ordeal had a way through. But beyond that opening, for these men, was not an already imagined Pacific filled with islands and trade winds and future empires. It was a blank, The maps they carried did not show a recognizable coastline curling around a known ocean. They were working with fragments, reports that there might be a sea beyond the American landmass, guesses at latitudes where some passage might exist, distant rumours touched and retouched by earlier voyages. So the relief of "we are not trapped" was immediately entangled with another feeling. We are about to enter something no one we know has ever crossed. The swell, now more powerful and steady, underscored that tension. A big sea promises movement, but it also promises distance. The same waves that tell you there is room to sail also tell you that land, anywhere, might be far away. To an exhausted crew, already weakened by rationing and cold, that prospect could easily blur from excitement into dread. The strait, for all its dangers, had at least offered the psychological comfort of shores on either side. You could, in theory, anchor. You could shelter from a storm. In the open ocean, even calm water could feel exposed. Later retellings tend to compress this moment into something cinematic. They show a narrow throat of land, a line of jagged rocks, and then suddenly the ships burst out into a sparkling vastness. Trumpets, perhaps, or some inner music of destiny. Magellan stands on the quarterdeck, gazes west, and knows in an instant that he has found a new ocean and opened a route that will change the world. That version matches what we want an age of discovery to feel like: clean edges, decisive gestures, an audible click as the door swings open. The surviving logbooks tell a quieter story. We see not a single instant of revelation, but a sequence of days where the language is steady, almost restrained. Bearings are noted, distances are estimated. The tone is factual even when the facts imply something enormous. When they finally name the ocean Pacific, the word appears as part of a sentence, not written in fireworks. It reflects the conditions they encountered, remarkably calm weather at the time of entry, rather than a metaphysical idea of peace. The sailors were not baptizing half the globe. They were describing what the sea felt like under their hulls in that specific week. That choice of name, born of a temporary stretch of fair conditions, is one of the clearest examples of how bodily experience and global storytelling diverge. To us, Pacific now carries centuries of association, trade routes, colonial wars, entire civilizations living along its shores. To them it was a practical label. This water, right now, is less violent than the storms we have known. The logbook style, the calm listing of wind and wave, the understated mention of an opening, suggests that for those aboard, the moment of exit did not feel like stepping through a sacred doorway. It felt like finishing one dangerous chapter and turning cautiously to the next. Even the certainty that they had reached a new ocean would have taken time to solidify. Over the first days in that water, they would have watched the behaviour of currents and skies, noted that landmarks fell away behind them without being replaced by new enclosing coasts, and slowly let themselves believe that they were no longer in some giant outer bay. Only when the pattern held, when the swell stayed long, the depths stayed great, and no land fenced them in, could the idea of another ocean move from theory to lived reality. From our vantage point, we like to imagine that history pivots on single crystalline instants. In their world, the pivot was extended, spread out over days of cautious sailing and sparse entries in ink. They did not know that their quiet passage from one water to another would later be framed as a world historical turning point. They only knew that the land was thinning, the sea was changing, and a new kind of uncertainty was opening in front of them, wide, calm, and for the moment unnamed. From the deck, the change in water was a matter of inches and rhythm. Back in Europe, it became a matter of lines and claims. News of the passage did not cross the Atlantic at the speed of a turning tide. It moved in the slow way information travelled in the early 16th century, carried in the memories of surviving crew, in bundles of charts and letters, in the guarded conversations of officials in Seville and Valladolid. But once it arrived, it did something the quiet swell at the western exit could not. It rearranged how powerful people thought about the world. For the Spanish crown, the meaning was brutally simple. The Treaty of Tordesillas had already sliced the globe along an imaginary meridian, dividing future discoveries between Spain and Portugal. That agreement had been written when the Americas were still mostly rumour. Now the Spanish could say, with some justification, that there existed a navigable link between the Atlantic, their side of the line, and the great unknown sea on the other. In theory, this meant a western route to the Spice Islands that did not cross waters claimed by Portugal around Africa. The strait itself in those first reports was less a landscape than an argument. If there was a channel and Spain controlled its entrance, then Spain could claim not only new lands but new paths. Paper power, not sailors battling current and wind, but ministers drawing loops and arrows on maps, projecting themselves into oceans no one in those rooms had ever seen. Portugal, of course, read the same news with a different emphasis. For them, the passage was not proof of Spanish destiny. It was a threat to hard-won monopolies, their entire eastern system, fortresses along the African coast, outposts in India and the Indies, was built on the assumption that anyone wanting cloves and nutmeg by sea would have to pass Portuguese guns. A western back door, even a difficult one, weakened that position. The response from both kingdoms followed a familiar pattern in imperial history: secrecy and rush. Spanish authorities tried to control the flow of information. Charts were classified. Pilots who had survived the voyage were questioned, sworn to silence, sometimes rewarded, sometimes sidelined. At the same time, new expeditions were planned, because a channel is only strategically real if you can use it more than once. Those follow-up voyages did what history often does to heroic firsts. They complicated them. Some captains found the entrance, but turned back in the face of storms or mutiny. Others made the passage and confirmed what the men of 1520 had already learned in their bones. The route was real, but it was not friendly. Currents were treacherous. Winds were unreliable. The latitude meant brutal weather in certain seasons. A strait that on a flat map looked like a singular decisive cut between continents was, in lived experience, a maze that could close on you without warning. Each new attempt added small corrections. One expedition charted an inlet that turned out to be a dead end. Another measured a bay more precisely. A third tested whether some rumoured shortcut existed farther south and found only more broken coast and worse seas. The shape of the passage, on paper, slowly sharpened. Peninsulas were erased or redrawn. Islands migrated, shrank, or vanished under the pressure of better data. But as the lines settled, the legend grew. Long before the route became a regular highway of trade, it became a story. Pilots' manuals and nautical rutters began to mention the channel as a place of exceptional risk. The tales sailors tell each other in harbours, about sudden willy wars, about ghostly fires on the shorelines, about ships vanishing in snow squalls, started to cluster around this one narrow cut at the bottom of the world. To be a pilot who had seen the strait became a credential, a mark of hard-won experience. Paradoxically, its very impracticality helped fix it in European imagination. The first Spanish and later English and Dutch ventures that tried to use it as a main artery to Asia learned quickly that other routes, though longer in miles, could be safer in time and lives. The winds of the Cape of Good Hope, the later discovery of open ocean tracks across the Pacific, even the option of crossing land and re-embarking elsewhere, all of these often outcompeted the cramped, icy throat between Atlantic and Pacific. Yet the idea of a southern passage, wrested from storms and unknown coasts, was too evocative to discard. Admirals could avoid the strait in practice and still invoke it in speeches as proof of national daring. Mapmakers could etch it prominently with decorative lettering long after its commercial value had been downgraded. The narrative of first through had a staying power that the mundane calculations of cost and risk could not erase. Over the centuries, that narrative migrated. It left pilots' notebooks and royal archives and moved into the kinds of sources most of us meet first: schoolbooks, adventure stories, paintings, later films and documentaries. With each move, some details fell away. The strait on the page straightened. The labyrinth became a line, sometimes even a neat, almost symmetrical curve, as if a god with a compass had cut the continents apart at a single stroke. The weeks of cautious probing, the false channels, the uncertainty about where river ended and sea began, all of that was compressed into an almost cinematic sequence, searching, despairing, and then at the last moment, finding. Artwork picked up the same rhythm. Engravings and canvases tended to show high, jagged cliffs, tiny ships framed against wild skies, a dramatically narrow gateway. Very few artists were interested in the ordinary reality of many stretches of the passage: low cloud, shifting rain, grey water stretching toward other headlands that look very similar to the ones behind you. Drama makes better pictures, modern documentaries. Even careful ones often inherit this staging. They have their reasons. A clear before and after a single moment of discovery is easier to show and easier to remember. Viewers like a threshold they can point to. Here is where the Atlantic ends. Here is where the Pacific begins. The messy, gradual realization that the men of 1520 actually lived through a stack of small observations, none of them decisive alone, does not translate as cleanly into a 30-second segment. Textbooks do something similar with words. They standardize. They pick an agreed-upon phrase. Magellan discovered the Strait of and repeated across editions and decades. The uncertainties in the sources, the debates among historians over which inner channel was followed, on which day, the possibility that some features were misidentified or never seen at all, these become footnotes if they are mentioned at all. This is not necessarily malicious. It is how large stories fit into small spaces. But it does mean that the Magellan Strait in most people's minds is several steps removed from the cold, shifting water the sailors actually felt under their boots. Responsible skepticism when we talk about voyages like this does not mean throwing up our hands and saying nothing can be known. It means holding two things in view at once. On the one hand, that there really was an extraordinary feat of navigation and endurance in 1520 to 1521. Ships crossed from one great ocean to another through a route no Europeans had recorded before. Men measured, watched and steered in conditions that would test any crew. On the other hand, that almost every layer of retelling, from the earliest official reports to modern media, has smoothed rough edges, filled gaps, and assigned clear motives and realizations where the primary accounts give us only glimpses. Skepticism in this context looks like a gentle loosening of certainty. When a story says Magellan saw X, we can ask, which document says that? Whose voice written when? When a map in a textbook shows a precise line through the strait, we can remember that early charts wobbled, that even today captains choose different tracks depending on ship and season. When a documentary frames the passage as a single heroic breakthrough, we can quietly recall the other ships that turned back, the pilots who doubted, the years it took for anyone to decide the route was worth the risk. Instead of making the achievement smaller, this kind of questioning can make it more human. It brings back the fog, the hunger, the arguments on deck about whether to push into another nameless channel or hold position and wait for clearer weather. It reminds us that no one in 1520 knew they were starring in a future legend about a strait at the end of the world. They were responding hour by hour to winds, currents, and fears. When we let the story be that complicated, something else becomes possible. We can look at other tales of exploration with their own neat arrows on maps and clean speeches at turning points, and ask where they too have been cut to fit. Not to strip away wonder, but to relocate it, not in flawless heroes and perfect moments, but in fallible people, narrow margins, and the strange way a line of ink on a chart can grow over centuries into a myth that feels as solid as rock. And with that mindset, the question, what did Magellan see, becomes less about defending a single image of towering cliffs and a sharp-edged gateway, and more about tracing how a few sparse logbook entries turned, very slowly, into the version of the strait most of us carry in our heads when we close our eyes and picture the end of one ocean and the beginning of another. So what, at the quietest level, can we say he probably did see? Not the clean doorway of later paintings. More likely, a drawn-out sequence of cold shifting channels, low cloud and headlands that refused to line up into a single obvious path. A labyrinth of water and rock, where every turn could end in a cul-de-sac, and every night brought the possibility that the tide or the wind would undo the last day's hard-won progress. He saw fires on distant shores, but not the meanings we later wrapped around them. Not Land of Fire as a poetic title, but ordinary human hearths and signal blazes glimpsed from moving decks, interpreted through fear, distance, and the need to turn anonymous coasts into named places. He saw people, but mostly as silhouettes and rumours. Figures on beaches, canoes that appeared and vanished, reports filtered through frightened interpreters and exhausted officers. The thick, textured presence of indigenous societies in that region, languages, trade routes, their own stories about these waters barely enters the European record, not because those worlds were thin, but because his tools for seeing them were. He navigated with dead reckoning, crude soundings, the occasional glimpse of stars through cloud. No satellite image, no bird's-eye outline of a neat S-shaped passage, just a series of guesses, corrected and recorrected under pressure. Against that lived reality, the gaps in what we were later told stand out. Maps give us a narrow, elegant cut. The logs suggest a messy search through something much more tangled. Names like Strait of Magellan and Tierra del Fuego feel like solid facts, but they were political and poetic choices layered over landscapes that already had other names. The myth of a single heroic discovery compresses months of uncertainty, mutiny, near starvation, and the simple possibility that another captain might have turned back and left the strait a blank on European charts for decades more. History, in this sense, is a negotiation between what the surviving evidence lets us say and what our storytelling habits want to do with that evidence, between logbook and legend, between the cold, wet, tired eyes on deck in 1520 and our tidy diagrams of the world tonight. Letting those two layers sit side by side doesn't make the story smaller. It makes it softer at the edges, easier to live with as you fall asleep. The strait becomes less a test you have to remember exactly, and more a place where real people once tried, failed, argued, and tried again. If you'd like to wander through more deep time before you sleep, there's also a book waiting for you, 12 prehistoric secrets about our species, gathered and told in the same slow, careful way. You can find it on the website. There's a link in the description if you're curious. If this kind of gentle, questioning history keeps you company at night, you can help it continue by subscribing to the channel, tapping like, or leaving a review in the form of a comment. If you feel like sharing one more small piece of data, you might write where you're listening from, what coast or city or inland room this story has reached. Somewhere, far south, the real waters of the strait are still moving in the dark. The lines on our maps will keep trying to catch up.